What's up, guys? A few videos ago, I did a bass playthrough of a studio track that I wrote with my friend Mike called Relentless Ascension. And today we're going to be mixing that song. We're also going to be talking about workflow, session prep, how to do routing, how to set up mix templates, basically everything that I think is important to get you from a blank session to a finished mix. I'm really excited. There's a lot of stuff that I want to get into, and I can already tell this is going to be kind of a long video. So make sure you check the timestamps so that you can see everything that we're going to cover and you can skip around to anything that you think is important. But I do highly encourage you to watch from start to finish because we're going to cover a lot of things that most people don't. We're not just going to jump directly into the mix. We're going to talk about importing the files and all of the session prep that's included. So if you're interested in learning about editing, about routing, about session prep, all of the stuff that happens before you actually get to start mixing, we're going to cover all of it. So stick around and let's get into this. I don't just want to open up my mix session because I feel like that's going to skip over a bunch of important details that you may want to know. So instead, I'm going to open up a blank Reaper session and I'm going to walk you through importing tracks, track naming, mix templates, routing, setting up your MIDI drums, editing, and basically all the stuff that falls into the category of mix prep. Talking about the session prep first is going to help you understand exactly how a mix engineer uses your tracks, how they set things up to work quickly and efficiently, and it shows you how much work they put into a session before they can even start mixing. Even if you're a mix engineer yourself, this can help you understand how to be better organized, how to work quicker, and how to communicate properly with your clients so that you can cut down on your mix prep time and get right into mixing. So first things first, we need to download the audio files. You can find a link to this in the description, or you can go to my website, allwineaudio.com, and right here at the top of the page, you're going to see Metal Multitracks. I'm planning on adding to this list as I write and finish mixing some more songs, but for now, we just have Relentless Ascension. So you've got some information about the track here. Down at the bottom, you can see what I used for bass and guitars, what we use for MIDI drums, and how we track the vocals. And then you can just click here to download the tracks. When you click the link, it's going to take you to a Google Drive. All you really need are the multi-tracks right here in this zip file. But if you do want to hear the bass in isolation from the bass playthrough, or if you would like the bass track in MIDI form to use some kind of MIDI bass library, you can download that here. But all you really need are the multi-tracks. So go ahead and click that and download it. When it's finished downloading, you can open up the track and save this anywhere that you would save your audio files at. For now, I just have mine saved to the desktop so that I can run through how to do this properly. So when you download, you're going to see this zipped folder here. You just want to right-click it and extract. You're going to need either WinZip or 7-Zip or some kind of zip program. They're free. You can just Google it really quick if you don't have it already on your computer. And when it unzips, you're going to see all of the folders with the audio files in them, and then there's this README file. When you open the README file, there's just some basic instructions. Set the BPM to 100 in your DAW, then import the drum MIDI, and then import all of the other tracks. This is just to ensure that the tempo doesn't get messed up and tracks don't get stretched if you do them in the wrong order. So just make sure you're doing things in this order. And then there's a little bit of information down at the bottom regarding tunings and strings and Kemper profiles and all that stuff. Now, before we import these files into Reaper, first I want to talk about mix templates. All right, now before we jump into this mix template, we're going to import the files into a blank session just to show you basically why mix templates are so important. Let's follow our directions here. We're at 100 BPM already, so we're at a good place. So we're going to drag the drum MIDI in. Okay. You can see it opened up a tempo, a tempo lane up here for us at 100. We're going to pull this down. You can see all the drum MIDI, and you can also see all of the markers from my session that mark off where each section of the song is at. Now, the tempo is correct, the drums are in. Let's import the rest of the files. So we're going to grab all of this stuff, all the wave files. We're going to drag those in. Okay. Now, I'm not going to import all the files because ultimately we're going to use a mix template. But the reason why I wanted to show this to you is because when you have a blank session and you import all these files, the tracks are going to be named whatever the file name is. And I did a good job of naming things the way that I like them to be named because it's my song. But when you receive files from somebody, they could have all kinds of wacky names, anything from Untitled to Guitar 1 to any vague, crazy mismatch of letters. Sometimes we just kind of smash the keyboard when we're typing in file names. So that's one of the downsides of importing onto a blank session, is that everything is just going to be named whatever the file name is, and that could be confusing if the person sending you those files doesn't name things the same way that you do, or if they don't name things accurately at all. Also, we would have to set up a bunch of groups, right? So we've got all of our drums. Now I would need to organize them the way that I want them to be organized. So that would be, we would want the close kick mics at the top, and then we want the overhead and rooms, and then we would want the snare top, and then we would want the snare bottom, and then the snare overhead and rooms, and then I would do the tom close mics, tom far mics, and the overheads and the room tracks. It just takes time, and if we had a mix template that already had these things set up and named properly, it wouldn't take that much time. So instead, we're going to use a mix template. Now, you can find this mix template on my website under the freebies section if you want to use it. It's almost identical. I've made some changes. You know, I always make changes to my templates as I learn new things, but ultimately, the template is going to look like this. We've got our master track here at the top. We've got a pre-master track, and I'll explain the naming conventions. I'll explain why I do things the way that I'm doing them as we go along. These are all of the tracks that are going to lie outside of the mix bus processing. Then we've got our mix bus. We've got all of our extras, which are things like bass drops, risers, impacts, post-production stuff. And then we've got vocals, guitars, bass, drums. I always do things in this order. I always use certain colors for certain things. And then at the bottom, I have reference tracks, which these are just songs that I like to reference when I'm mixing. Then I have extra files. If the actual song file is included, which I did include, I'll stick it down here. Like if there's a demo version of the song or something like that. If there's a click track, or if there's any kind of voiceover, sometimes artists will send me voiceover for the beginning of a song that'll be like 1, 2, 3, start type of thing. So these are just extra files. We've got extra guitars, so if I need to record any guitars, like if I want to add a lead or something, if I just want to get creative with a client's mix, I already have my Kemper sitting right next to me, routed into this template, so if I need to record something, I'll just plug my guitar in, hit record, and go. So it's very simple. And then lastly, we've got render buses. So when I'm done with a mix, if the client wants a version of the mix without vocals, or if they want just the guitars, or if they want backing tracks or whatever, I have a lot of that already set up and routed, so that if I need a bass track, I just hit record and hit play. Very simple. So again, all of this is to save time, and it's to do things efficiently so that we can be creative as soon as possible. Now, when you're looking at this template, obviously there's a lot of plugins active. If you're familiar with Reaper, any green effects section is something that has a plugin on it. The plugins really don't matter for the sake of using this template. The most important aspects are that it's organized the same way every time. Things are in a certain order, things are colored a certain way, things are named a certain way, and the routing. So any side chains, any processing that lies outside of the mix bus, these are all of the things that make a mixing template worth using. And I'm gonna basically run through each element of this mix template so you can understand why I have things the way that they are. Let's come down to the bottom. So ignore all these gray tracks. First I have drums. And the way that I do drums, MIDI drums at least, is I don't like using bleed at all. That's just a problem that I don't need to have. So starting down here at the bottom, we've got overheads, rooms, we've got an overhead track, we've got a close room and a far room. These just have cymbals. I have taken all of the shells out of the overhead and room tracks. And then we have close. So this is just the hi-hat and the ride close mics. This all together is my cymbals group. Above the cymbals group, I have a send. So it's basically just sending all of these tracks right here into this green track labeled cymbal smash. And usually on the cymbal smash, I'll have something like a compressor set really extreme, or a clipper, or a limiter, or maybe distortion, or some combination of those things to smash the hell out of the cymbals and then blend it in. So anytime you see a green track here, this is volume automation. Now there's obviously no volume automation done because this is just a track template, but if you shift click, you can add points, and then you can turn things up and down, and basically all I'm doing is I'm creating a version of the cymbals that's smashed and really, really level, and I'm blending it in to the dynamic version of the cymbals to get the cymbals to cut through the mix to the level that I think is appropriate. And I'm going to undo all of that stuff. Now, above the cymbals, we've got all of the shells. So we've got the toms group, and underneath that are all of the tom close mics and the tom overhead and room tracks. Same thing with the snare. We've got the snare group, we've got the close mics, and we've got the room mics and the overhead mics. And I also have 2 extra tracks. This is specifically for ghost notes. A lot of times when you're compressing and distorting drum tracks, you can make your ghost notes too loud. So what I'll do is I'll go in and cut out the ghost notes that have been brought up too much because of processing, and I'll chop them up and move them to this ghost notes track so that they still remain quiet and subtle in the mix. And then I have this snare trigger. And what I'm doing is I am sending the snare overhead track into this snare trigger track, and I like to use the overhead as a trigger for snare samples because the overheads are always really spiky and they really clearly define where each snare hits at, especially because there's no cymbal bleed. So I just find that it works better than using the close mic. And all I'm doing is I am triggering, let's see, I have the Slack Beauty close snare from GGD Slammers. So this is a one-shot snare sample. And let's go GGD Slammers, snares. They've got all of these different sounds. Cool. So there you can hear the snare trigger sample that I'm using. Now, pretty similar to the snare group, on the kick we've got the overheads and rooms separate, and then I have the left and right kick drum close mics separated. And this is because sometimes I like to pan the left and the right kick drum just slightly to the left and the right, mainly just on fast kick sections. It helps separate things a little bit, and you'll see I have 10% panning on the left kick drum, and then I have automation set up on the right. So anywhere that I'm not panning the kicks, like during slow sections where somebody could easily 1-foot the entire kick pattern, I'm going to leave this centered. And then let's say it switches to a fast double kick section, I'm going to add an automation point, and I'm going to make the left slightly left and the right slightly right. And then you've got the kick group, which is all of these grouped together, and then you have the MIDI track itself. Now in my template, if you pull up the MIDI, you will see that the drums are already named on the piano roll. So if you import my MIDI map and the note names, you will see everything is already named and ready to go. And then we have the all drums group. So this is how I do my color coordinating and my organization. All of the drums go together under this red track. Now we'll do bass, which you'll see is the same way. At the top you have the all bass track. Underneath that you have the bass group. And I do something a little bit different with bass. What I do, and I do something similar with the guitars, is I use ToneForge DI Match. And I have a profile in here saved of my Quake. And I've saved 3 different versions. I've got a high, low, and a mid. And these are basically the lowest string of the Quake, the middle string of the Quake, and the high string of the Quake. And I have sampled the EQ response of the Quake. And what I'm doing is I'm placing the Quake on this midline, and then I'm using these different versions of the Quake profile to automate brightness and more low end. So if I get to a part in a song where I really don't need to hear the pick attack, I will just cut that track and slide that piece of audio down to the low track. And if I need more string sound, more pick attack, I'll do the same thing. I'll cut that little piece out and move it up to the high track. And you'll see more what I mean when we get into the actual mix. Now, all of these DI tracks, these versions of ToneForge DI, the reason I like to do this is not so much to get a specific sound, but I'm also using it for level matching. No matter what DI I put on this track, it's going to level match to the profile that I've created. And that means that every time I do a mix, the bass track level is always going to be the same. When I'm feeding it into an amp sim or into a distortion plugin, I know exactly what level that bass is going to be at so that I can gain stage things the exact same way in every single mix. This saves me a ton of time, it saves me some headaches, and it just helps keep things consistent as far as the template is concerned. Now, that doesn't mean I can't get different sounds. Obviously, I can still get different sounds, I can use different amp sims, I can use different techniques, but I'll always know that the bass DI is at a specific level. That bass DI group is being fed into 3 tracks, a clean, a distortion, and a sub. This is not groundbreaking stuff, this is what almost everybody does. The sub is basically just removing everything above 100 Hertz. The distortion is basically just focusing in on the mid-range. And then the clean track is everything above 100 Hertz. Those 3 tracks all summed together is what goes into the bass group, and then I just have some additional processing on all bass. And again, we can use volume automation to get creative with these things and make them more dynamic, but ultimately, this is the way that I process bass on almost every single song that I do. Now with the guitars, pretty straightforward. We've got a clean group down here that we're not using because there's no clean guitars. We have a lead group and a rhythm. We have a lead group and a rhythm group. There's a left, right, and a center for the leads because sometimes you just want a single tracked center lead guitar, so it's there if you need it. And then a left and right rhythm. And I'm doing the same trick that I did on bass. I am using a profile of my Maslow, my 7-string guitar, and I'm just using it for level matching. You can see the spectral matching here is disabled, and I just have this on so that every time I start a mix and I drop a guitar DI onto this track, it's going to be the same level every time, just for consistency. And then after that, you can run whatever amp sims you want. I have a lot of stuff going on here, which will make more sense once we get into the actual mix. And then all guitars, I have the processing on all of the guitars as a whole. For the vocals, we've got the main center vocal. If there are any doubles, we've got a double track. And then we have a left and a right, which are panned to the perfect number. And then we have our sends up here. So these 3 tracks, or these 4 tracks, are the main vocals. And I have it labeled Vox Dry Group. That means no reverb, no delay, no ear candy stuff. This is just the leveled vocal. Now we have the wet group. This is feeding the dry group into this room verb, this long tail reverb, and this delay. And these are all set by default at -infinity. You can use whatever plugins you want for each of these. Again, the important thing is that this stuff is routed ahead of time so that I don't have to set any of this up. I have my go-to plugins on there, and if for some reason repeater is not working for me for delay, I can just load up a different delay plugin. I don't have to do all of the routing every time I start a mix. The dry group is being fed only into this vocal distortion track, which I just have some compression, some limiting, some clipping, some distortion. I'm just smashing the hell out of the vocal track, out of the dry vocal track specifically. And then all of that together is being fed into this heavy Vox group, and then we just have the all Vox processing. So a lot of this is just for separation. It's just so that it visually is easy to understand, and I'm not constantly asking, okay, what's going on this track, or where did I send that bus? I know if it's green, it's a send. I know if it's blue, it's a group. If it's red, it's everything. Then we have all of the extras, pretty straightforward. And then all of these top tracks, the all extras, all vocals, all everything is going into the mix bus. And the mix bus has got your typical stuff on it, right? We've got a clipper, we've got something bringing up the quiet information in the mix, we've got a multi-band compressor, and then we have this limiter. Now at the top of the mix, above the mix bus, all of these green tracks are things that lie outside of the mix bus. So if you've ever tried to mix a song and your bass drops were making the limiter, basically it's making the audio hit the limiter really hard because your bass drops take up a lot of energy, you can send your bass drops outside of the mix, and that's exactly what I have routed up here. Old just means that they are bass drops that were provided with the tracks. New is if I decide to add any new bass tracks. It just helps me distinguish between the two. We have outside box, so the entire vocal track has been routed to this outside vocal bus. And then I can just use the volume fader to determine how much of the vocal goes outside of the mix bus processing. So if you're hitting your mix bus really hard, it can pump the mix, and sometimes that's what you want, but it can make the vocals duck a little bit, like when the drums hit really hard or if there's a lot, like a wall of guitars going on. So this will allow you to get the vocals loud without them being pushed down by whatever you have going on in the mix bus. This technique is really useful for bass drops, for vocals, for snare bombs, for kick sections, for the bass, basically anything that you want to keep in front of the mix that's being negatively affected by your mix bus processing. Now at the top of all of this, on the pre-master, I just have an EQ, and all it's doing is removing anything under 20 Hertz. I think that's more of a peace of mind thing for me than anything. It probably isn't really doing much. And then lastly, I have a tape machine on the master. I have Mongoose, which just makes sure that under a specific frequency, everything is turned into mono. Sometimes I use it and sometimes I don't. And then lastly, we have a final limiter, and that's just to catch any stray peaks from these outside tracks. Because remember, they're bypassing the limiter on the mix bus, and it could cause your mix to go over the zero line. So this is just here to rein in any stray transients. Now, one other thing, and I'm not going to go over all of this stuff, but there are a lot of sends, a lot of buses that are all pre-connected in this template. Like the vocals are being sent to the outside vocal bus. The vocals are also being sent to the lead group, to the lead guitars, and to the cymbals, so that I can put soothe on them, and I can sidechain comp the vocals to the cymbals and to the lead guitars to keep the vocals on top of everything. I also have the guitars being sent to the bass, so that I can again sidechain the bass with the guitars. And these aren't things that I always do, but if I ever want to, all I have to do is open up an EQ or a compressor and set it to external sidechain, and that stuff's already ready to go. I can duck the bass out of the way without having to set up that bus and set up the sidechain. It's already done and ready for me. So that really gets to my point that a mix template is really more about saving time and being efficient, and getting to the creative stuff as quickly as possible. There's this kind of misconception that if you use a mix template, all of your mixes are going to sound the same, and that's not really how it works as long as you're a creative mixer. Like I said, the plugins on here aren't really the important part of the template. I'm constantly changing and updating this template with different stuff, different compressors, different amp sims, so the plugins really don't matter. It just matters that things are organized properly, and that every time you sit down to mix, you're putting things in the same place every time. It's like being in your kitchen, right? You have a specific place for everything. You have a specific cabinet for bowls and cups and silverware, so that anytime you need something, you can go to the same place and save yourself the time and frustration of going, oh, where did I put that? Mixing should be the same way. You don't want to start with a blank session every time you work on a song. You should know what tools you need, generally speaking, and have them in a place that you can easily find them and identify them every single time. So now that we understand the template, we understand why things are named the way that they are, why things are organized a certain way, now we can import our files. And it's going to be a little bit different this time because all of these things are already named, right? So all we're going to do is we're going to open up and we're going to go kick sum, goes to kick sum, kick sub, goes to kick sub. Now, I didn't use the split kick trick on this song because there's not really a whole lot of super fast double kicks. So you can just delete one of these kick groups. Oh, I'd probably remove the left one because it's not being routed into contact. This is just an extra track that I created. What's nice about using a template at this point is that now we can just drop tracks in, and they're already going to be named the way that we like them to be named. They're already going to be organized and in the place that we want them to be. This stuff's already going to be sent to any relevant buses. We don't have to set them up now. And again, just a huge time saver. And now we can get into the next step of the mixing process without wasting a whole bunch of time just getting the session to play, basically. Now, another concept that's important to talk about is track naming. So if we come back to this, like I said, I tried to do a really good job of naming things appropriately so that you can easily identify what is what and where it needs to go in your template or whatever it is you're using in your DAW. Now, this says, for example, guitar solo 1. So if we come up here to guitars, it's probably going to be a center lead, right? So let's take guitar solo 1, and we're going to drop it here. Makes sense, right? We've got the solo here at the end of the song. But what if this track was just named guitar, right? If it just said guitar track 1, well, where do I drop it in my template? Well, I'm not really sure, so what I would end up doing is I would just drop it somewhere and hit play and listen to it. But if it's a DI track, it may not be super obvious that it's a rhythm guitar or a lead guitar, and you can see how this easily eats up a ton of setup time. So that's why naming stuff appropriately is so important, because your mix engineer is going to open up these folders and they're going to go, okay, DI main left, this is the rhythm guitar. You know, DI backing left. Okay, this is a background guitar. It's meant to be in the background and not in the foreground. The more detailed you can be with your track naming, the more easily your engineer can get into the mix and understand what your intentions were for each track. Another good example of this is if you go to the vocals, right? You've got main vocal and you've got vocal dub. They're exactly what they sound like. This is the main vocal. This needs to be the loudest vocal in the mix. This is a double, which is just meant to reinforce the main vocal, and you can set it at a moderate level underneath the main. And then these two tracks are meant to be panned left and right. Sometimes the left and right track accompany the main vocal and there's a triple track, sometimes there's not, and that's intentional on my part. I wanted there to be parts where the vocals sound wide, parts where they sound narrow, parts where they sound like a wall. So I named things accordingly, and if I were sending this to someone else to mix, it would save them a ton of time. They could easily go, oh, I only need 4 vocal tracks. They can still get creative and try different things, but they'll know what your intention was, which will help them get a result that you're going to like quicker. Before we get started mixing, there's probably going to be some issues when you go to hit play. Now, I haven't imported all the tracks because I'm going to switch over to my mix session here in just a second. But let's say you have your blank session or your template pulled up, you've imported all the tracks, you hit play, there's probably going to be some issues, right? It's not all just going to be perfectly level and ready to go for you instantly. Especially if you're using the MIDI. If you don't plan on using the supplied printed out drums and you're just using the MIDI, you're going to hit play and you're going to hear no drums. So the first thing you need to do is you need to make sure that things are mapped the way that you want them to be. So if you pull up the picture that's included in the drum folder, you can see on the left hand side how I named the piano roll, and you can see where each part of the kit lies on the piano roll. I've also supplied the piano roll note names themselves, which are right here. So if you want to, you can pull up the MIDI track, you can right click over here, and go to File, Note CC Names, you can load and choose a file, and you can just go to that text file that I included, and it will automatically name the left hand side for you. But I highly recommend working with the drums in a way that's familiar to you, right? All of this is about saving time and getting to the creative stuff. Nobody wants to mess around with MIDI for hours. So what you want to do is you want to look at the MIDI track itself. So let me import that really quick. So when I pull up the MIDI, this is what you're going to see. And I have kick, snare, toms, hi-hat, and then all of the cymbals on top. But let's say you like your toms being high to low instead of low to high. You should rearrange that MIDI so that it works for you, so that it's the same way you would work with MIDI on your own stuff. If you do decide that you want to work with the MIDI the way that I've supplied it, you can pull up your drum program, go into settings, and there should be a MIDI map section, and you can just compare this to the text file notes, and you can make changes and put things wherever you want them. You want to be comfortable and you want to feel familiar with how you're mapping the MIDI so that you can play with the velocities and the humanization and do all of that stuff the way that you want to. The next thing that we would need to do is set up the guitar ToneForge DI. So what you need to do is hit capture source and let the song play for, I don't know, maybe 30 seconds. Listen to a couple of different parts of the song and it will load up an EQ graph on here, and just make sure you have level matching set to 100%. And this is, if I want to use the spectral matching, sometimes I automate it. If I need things to be brighter in a section, I'll automate it to 50 or 100%, turn it off for sections where the guitars don't need to be as bright. There's a lot of options there. So I would set this up for all of the guitar tracks, the rhythms and the leads and the solo. And then for vocals, a similar approach. I like to start vocals with EQ and gain reduction 2 from JST. And so what I'll do is I'll go into gain reduction 2 and I'll shift double click and let the vocal play for a few seconds. And this will give us a good starting position for the vocals as far as loudness. So this, setting up gain reduction on the vocals, setting up ToneForge, the level matching on the guitars and on the bass, and then setting up the drum MIDI to be where I want it to be. That's my initial start to a mix. That gets everything to a point where I can hear everything in the mix and I can start actually identifying where problems are at and start solving them. Once I have all of the track processing ready, the DIs are being level matched, the vocals are being level matched, then I just want to make sure that all of my top-down processing is being applied properly. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hit play on one of the heavier, more dense parts of the song, and then I'm going to go to my mix bus, and I'm just going to make sure that I'm hitting the clipper somewhere around -1, because I don't want to overdo it. I don't want to smash the mix. Max volume I always have set right around -40 on the low level. That's the only part of this plugin that I'm using, and it just brings up the quiet stuff in the mix a little bit. So it's like applying a limiter and then gain staging, turning the mix up after it's been limited. It's basically just doing that all in one step for me. Then I have this multi-band compressor, which I usually leave disabled until I'm towards the end of a mix. It can really drastically change things, and it needs to be set up in a particular way, which I will get to later on in the mix session. And then lastly, we have a limiter. And again, I just want to make sure that the limiter is not being hit by more than like 1 or 2 dB. Anything more than that, and you tend to get some pumping going on, and we can get creative with that. But for the most part, at the beginning stages of a mix, I want to leave all of that stuff out. I only have this stuff turned on to get a better sense of how things are going to sit at the end of the mix. Once my mix bus is squared away and there's no issues there, I'm just going to double check the actual master track. And again, the virtual tape machine and Mongoose I'm going to keep off until I get to the end of the mix and I start making some fine adjustments. I just want to make sure that my final limiter isn't smashing the mix too hard, you know, maybe 2 or 3 dB at the most. So now we've got the DI match set up, we have the gain reduction 2 level match set up, we have the drum MIDI ready to go, we have the top-down mixing elements ready, like the mix bus and the master track aren't set to the extreme, right? They're just turned on. Now that we're in a position where we could hit play on the song, and I'm going to listen through it start to finish, and as the song plays, I'm going to do 2 things. I'm going to use the Shift M shortcut, which will bring up this. It'll let you add a marker to the song and name it. And what I'm going to do is, as the song is playing, I'm going to mark what the chorus is, what the verse is, where the breakdown's at, all of the key transitional moments in the song. I'm going to map those out with the markers. I'm going to identify any problems or anything that I think needs to be fixed immediately. One problem that I have as a mix engineer is that I start to fall in love with the mix. The more I listen to it, it's just like with a guitar tone. The more you listen to your guitar and make tweaks, the less objective you can be at the end. And you tend to kind of fall in love with whatever it is you're listening to. So if there are editing problems, if there's like time alignment issues, or if there are tuning issues, or maybe areas that need to be silenced better, maybe some strip silencing or some noise gates, if I listen to that part, even with its problems too many times, I start to kind of listen past the problems. So my first 2 or 3 listens through the song, I'm going to mark down where each transition point's at, but I'm also going to identify any problems that immediately hit my ears so that I don't forget to fix them. I'm going to make sure that my static mix sounds as good as it possibly can. And what I mean is, while I'm playing the song and I'm putting these markers in so that I can identify things for myself later, I'm probably going to notice, oh, the rhythm guitars need to come up a little bit, or maybe the bass guitar is a little bit too loud. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to each red group, each all track, and if the vocals or if the guitars need to come up, I'm going to bring them up. Maybe the vocals need to come down a little bit, so I'm going to bring them down. And I'm going to get my static mix to play as balanced as possible, and then I'm going to make these adjustments on the last plugin on that track. So if the guitars need to come up by 1.2 dB, I'm going to reset that back to 0, and I'm going to go to my last plugin, and I'm going to increase it by however much I need to increase it to level match it, to get that static mix back to where it was. This is so things sound optimal, and I know that my static mix is in the best place that it can be in without additional processing. Also, you get finer adjustments on your faders around the 0 mark. I can move my mouse just a little bit and get a nice gradient of values here, right? But if the fader is set to -50, moving the mouse just a little bit makes a huge difference. So one reason why I always reset my faders to 0 after the static mix is done is so that I have fine control over that fader later on in the mix. And I don't use faders really at all except for 2 reasons. If it's a gray track underneath a group, I'm using the faders only to blend stuff. So on guitars it's not really relevant, but on drums, for example, I'm going to get a blend of the room and the overhead tracks the way that I like it fed into this group here. That's the only thing I'm using the fader for. I want to process the kick with a certain amount of each element, and I'm just going to get that balance the way I like it while I'm mixing, and I'm going to leave it. But the group tracks themselves, these don't get moved until the mix is almost done. These are all of my last minute adjustments going into the master track. And so that's what I like to save those faders for. If I need to bring the snare up while I'm mixing, instead I will just go to whatever my last plugin was and turn it up or turn it down, do whatever I have to do, leave the fader at 0, and then when I get to the end of a mix and I need to make those really micro adjustments, I have all the resolution on that knob, and I know that if I make a change, if I'm rendering a mix out and I go, man, the snare is just too quiet, I'm going to turn it up 2 dB. Well, if that turns out to be too much and I want to go back to the original, all I have to do is double click the fader, bring it back to 0, and I know that that's where the mix was at before I made last minute tweaks. So this is just a further way for me to stay organized and know where I'm at in a mix. But at this point, we have a nice static mix, everything plays the way it should, we should have markers set up on all the transition points, and we should have all of our initial mix notes notated in the markers up here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to my final mix, and you're going to see that it looks pretty familiar, right? Everything is in the same order that we had in the template. We've got our master, our pre-master, we've got our outside buses, mix bus, and then we've got all of our red all tracks. So it's set up exactly the same way as in the template, barring just a few minor changes. And we'll identify those changes as we get into the mix. As a mix engineer, I love to mix, obviously. I love EQs and compressors and reverbs and all the fun, creative aspects of working on a mix. But the biggest, single most important thing has got to be editing. Editing, tuning, and MIDI humanization. Getting things to be aligned properly, getting things to hit at the same time, that's what creates a punchy mix. If your guitars and your bass and your drums and your vocals are all loose,
Like if they're not actually hitting at the same moment on beat 1 of the breakdown, if they're not all coherent during the chorus and complementing each other, no amount of mixing is going to make those elements sound like they're glued together. There will be a threshold at which your mix will not get any better. So I do all of the editing first. Another reason why we do editing before we get creative is because I think it's really important to separate objective and subjective tasks. Objective tasks are things like editing, tuning, humanization. These are things that objectively make your mix better. It doesn't matter who you are. Now, there are people who say that unpolished mixes are better, some people who prefer a more raw sound, but let's be real. We're in the metal genre. We want to be tight. We want to be almost robotic in our precision. That's what we're all shooting for as guitar players, bass players, drummers, is we want to be really tight as a band. And so editing is going to make mixing 10 times easier. The better the source tones are, the tighter everything is, the easier it is to mix, and the more fun it is to mix, because you can spend time making creative decisions instead of fixing problems. So first off, no vocal tuning. There's no singing in this song, so we're not going to tune any vocals. First thing we want to do is take a look at the drum MIDI. So let's go up here. We're going to pull up drum MIDI. All right, there's the song. Now, I have done a really good job automating the velocities, at least for the libraries that I'm using. I'm using a combination of Invasion and Modern and Massive. If you like the drum sound, if you like the printed down drum sound, and you want to use that sound yourself, there's a template on my website. It's called the Invasion plus Modern and Massive template, and it will get you the exact printed down drum sound that you're hearing here. It's mainly the kick from Invasion, the snare from Modern and Massive, and then the wide cymbals from Invasion, like all the effects cymbals, the chinas, and then just the crash cymbals from Modern and Massive. So it's a nice hybridization of the two kits. I'm getting the big massive snare and the really close bright crash cymbals out of Modern and Massive, and I'm getting all of the really deep toms, all of the extra effects cymbals, and the left and right kick drum out of Invasion. So that's why you see a left and right kick here, and that's why there's a left and right kick in the mixing template, because I'm using the left-right kick out of Invasion there. When it comes to humanizing drums, though, what we want to do is we want to first play with the velocities, and we want to get things sounding human. And the best way to do that is to have a nice starting place. Now, for me, the starting place is going to be bottom up. I'm always bottom up, right? I start with drums when I mix, and I work my way up to the bass, the guitars, and the vocals. So starting with drums, we're going to start with the kick. And as you can see here, the main downbeat is a little bit louder. My default kick is right around 100 on the velocity, and at 110 is where I'm increasing. So if we take a listen here, you can hear it's like da 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 da, right on that downbeat to give it some emphasis. Let's see here, what else we've got. There are some sections where the kick just needs to come forward, and I've just done that by bumping it up to 105. And you can hear it really sounds like the drummer is laying into the kick in this section, right? The cymbal changes up here to a china, which kind of adds to the intensity, and I felt that the kick also needed to increase in intensity in that section. And then we have the breakdown at the end of the song, and I went up to what I was using for the hard accent beats, right? That 110, I'm using for every kick in that section, and you can hear how the intensity really comes up. Right? So aside from that, we'll move on to the snare. And the snare, I'm programming around 100, 105. The hard hits, the flams, I tend to push the flams up to around 118, 120 plus, because I really want the flams to hit hard. The sections where I really want the snare to pop are around 110. And you can hear, even in this section, you know, when the kick picks up and starts playing double kicks, I kind of weaken the snare a little bit and then increase it as we get to the end of the line. A drummer would anticipate the end of that section coming and start hitting harder because they start to get excited and they start to get pumped up for the next part of the song. So it's important to try to think like a drummer, to try to feel like you're on stage performing the song, where the energy needs to come up and where it needs to come down, because things should ebb and flow. Even though it's a metal song, we don't want the drums to just be consistent loudness from start to finish, right? That contrast is what helps reel people in and feel the excitement of the song. And you can see throughout here, I'm kind of keeping the snare in that 100 to 110 range, and I'm reserving the 118 and 120 hits for the really hard accents. There's a little flam there in the transition section. Toms are kind of all over the place. Toms are really dynamic and they can be kind of difficult to get them to be audible in a mix. So anytime that we have some faster fills, I tend to dial the drums back a little bit, because the faster you're playing, you tend to hit a little bit quieter. And then we have some hard, wide flams, right? This is the two floor toms being hit together. And then as we move on to this section here, you're hearing left and right floor toms hit simultaneously. Right, so those fast sections we come down a little bit because we want to keep things human sounding. And then when they're spaced out and the drummer has time, we let him hit really, really hard. We've got some cymbal swells. The easiest way to do cymbal swells is to just right-click drag and select all of the notes that you want to swell, and then come down here and just click one of these little nodes, and then you can just use your mouse to automate however you want it to look. So that's how I do cymbal swells. And then also on the cymbals, anytime that we're playing a really fast cymbal, or anytime you're hitting a drum or a cymbal hard consecutively, as the drummer plays, he's going to get a little bit fatigued. Or as other elements are introduced into that drum section, he's not going to be able to pay attention equally to all parts. So as a part gets more complicated, whatever is being hit consistently, in this case the cymbal, we should have that kind of ride down in volume, as a real drummer would do. If we come over here, so we've got some more crash hits, and you can see I've automated the volume down in the middle. Because in the middle of those sections, I feel like the drummer would be more focused on the kick and the snare, as opposed to trying to hit the cymbal exactly the same way every time, right? He's going to come in heavy because he's excited to start the part, and then as the part plays out, he's going to focus less on the heavy hitting cymbal and more on making the kick and the snare pop out. And then we've got this section here, and you can see there's a lot going on here, right? We've got some floor tom stuff, we've got some hi-hats, we've got some cymbals. This is probably one of the more complex parts drum-wise, and because of that, you can see the snare is dialed back quite a bit. It's a lot lighter on the snare, a lot lighter on the kick. And this is because I would envision in this section the drummer is focusing more on all of the cymbal work than on the shells. Now, you'll notice all the cymbals here are pretty much all 127s. Almost the entire project, aside from the swells, you're just seeing 127s on cymbals. And there's a reason why. It's because I've done all of the volume automation inside GGD. So because I'm using a blend of drum kits, these main crash left and rights, these are modern and massive crashes. the wide ones come from Invasion, and the right China is from Eminem, and the left China is from Invasion. So because I have a mix of kits, they don't sound the same at 127. Every library kind of has its own velocity curve and has its own like quirks to it. And so I've went in to the actual mixer in Invasion and in Modern and Massive and set these cymbals to the volumes that I like, so that the main crashes are always louder than the wide crashes at the same velocity. I like to use these main crashes for brightness because they're really upfront, whereas the Invasion cymbals, the wide ones, are a little bit more dull on the top end, and they're a little more roomy sounding. So it's good for like accents and stuff that don't need to be right in your face. So I have all of this set up the way that I like it volume wise inside of the MIDI mixer. And that's why you're just seeing mostly 127s here. It's not because I was lazy, it's because I want the extra step to make this template sound the way I like it to sound. The one thing that I was a little bit lazy on was the actual position. I really only did position humanization on the toms, mostly because I just wanted this song to be really, really tight. It's more about the bass and the guitars and the vocals than it is about the drums. So I guess I could have done a better job humanizing the position of the drums. You'll see the kick has been humanized a little bit, not in every section, but it has been humanized, so it's not perfectly on grid. The cymbals, I could have pushed them a little bit late. That's something that I like to do. If you right click, drag, and click H, you're going to get the humanization menu. I don't like to humanize velocity. I like to do that by hand because there are various points, depending on the library that you're in, where the velocity changes really significantly. As an example, in Invasion, when the kick goes from 113 to 114, there's a really noticeable audible difference in the sample. There's a lot more top end in the kick once you hit 114. And if I were to use the velocity humanization, it may put some of the kicks above 14 or 114 and some of them below 114, giving this really inconsistent top end to the kick. So I only humanize notes with the Reaper shortcut to do timing, not velocity. Timing, you're going to find that right around 10 to 15% is where things start to sound too loose, especially if it's a faster song. The faster the song is, the tighter it needs to be because there's less room for error. On cymbals, I tend to be around 10-11% timing, and then on shells, I tend to be between like 5 and 8%. And again, it's program dependent because some songs need to be robotically tight. I felt like this song was one of them. And some songs need to be a little more loose. So if you've got a song with a lot of blast beats or a lot of really fast parts, humanizing somewhere between like 5 and 8% is usually going to be enough to make it sound a little more believable without it sounding bad and just sloppy. If you have something that's slower, like maybe like a stoner rock song or something that just doesn't have much intensity to it, you can push that to maybe 15% before it starts to sound obviously bad. So that's pretty much it for the drums. You can feel free to do what you think makes the drums sound better. You don't have to just stick with what I did, but this gives you a good idea of my thought process, how I like to go about humanizing things, and why I have things set up this way. So now I am going to minimize that. We'll take a look at the bass, and if you look here, I've got things mapped out on these low, mid, and high DI Tone Forge profiles. So let's take a listen to the bass. Let's try it here on the mid. Here's the low. Oops. Right? And then here's the high. Is it? Yeah. Now, it may sound like the low one is not actually the low one, right? It sounds a lot brighter, but I'm doing this based on the section itself. when I'm playing low octave stuff on the bass, that's when you're going to see a low octave track, right? So like the breakdown here at the end of the song. If I were to move these down to the mid, seeing a lot of that pick attack. And that just sounds like really throaty. So this low section really brings out the pick attack on what is otherwise a really rounded string. You have to keep in mind this lowest string is like a 200 plus gauge string, so it doesn't naturally have a ton of pick attack. And so I've created this lane specifically for the lowest sections of the bass. And then that mid-range is for the majority of the bass tracks. And then there's one section of the song where I'm actually playing in unison with the guitars on like the highest string of the bass, and that's on the high section. If we move this up here, you can see it's a lot warmer sounding on that midsection. So that's why we have this split apart the way it is. And again, this is just a profile of my Quake bass in the mid-range. And editing wise, you can see I've just cut out silences where they need to be. Right? There's no time stretching at all. It's all just me cutting and doing crossfades and making things line up with the drums better and making things line up with the guitars better. So this is really just a moderate amount of editing. I'm just cutting out silences where there doesn't need to be any bass during like choppy sections, and that's really about it. If we take a look at the guitars, these are all of the Kemper recordings that you got in your folder. I did not use the DIs for the final tracking. If we take a look, again, it's really nothing crazy. I'm just creating silences where there needs to be silences, and I have comped a bunch of takes here. So I probably went through this section several times and just chose the best versions of each. And then at that point we just crossfaded things together. Now what I like to do when I'm editing is, let's say we get to this section and we tighten things up, we get things where we want them, and we need to put a bunch of crossfades so nothing pops and clicks. What I'll do is right click drag, highlight all of the sections that need a crossfade, and double click, and then you can type in fade in and fade out. Typically about 0.02 is enough of a fade to apply, and then everything is crossfaded automatically. So that's, again, another huge time saver. But ultimately, what I'm doing is I'm listening to the drums in solo, and I'm playing the guitars, and making sure that the guitars line up with all the transients of the bass. And then I'll mute the guitars, and listen to just bass and drums, and get those to line up really well. And then I'll listen to all three together. And everything at that point should just line up and sound really punchy, even though there's really no mixing done yet. You can see there was just the slightest bit of time stretching here. That part just wasn't quite long enough. I had to stretch it out a little bit. But all in all, very minimal editing. It's just mostly getting rid of silences and crossfading to get rid of pops and clicks. And then let's go to vocals. So vocals were interesting because I wrote the entire instrumental first, and then I sent this off to my buddy Mike Roberts, and he did the vocals. And he was very flexible about the vocals. What he did is he got really familiar with the song, he wrote the lyrics, and then he performed the song 4 separate times using different rhythms, basically the same lyrics all 4 times, but approaching them slightly different rhythmically. It wasn't quad-tracked, it was 4 separate and different performances. I imported those 4 tracks, and then I cut them into pieces, and I did some time stretching. You can see there's a decent amount of time stretching in here because nothing was truly double tracked. Like I said, everything was kind of rhythmically different from track to track, so I had to piece things together and try to get creative to create double tracks. Some parts were closer than others, like you can see this double here. Sounds pretty damn good. And you can see I went in and crossfaded. Yep, so they start at the exact same moment. There's no pops at the beginning. And a lot of this is just being diligent with your editing and making sure that you don't leave any bad sounds in there, getting things to align properly. Like I said, these are completely different takes. I had to go in and kind of stretch things and get them to look similar. And this takes time, but you're ultimately just using your ear and comparing the takes and getting things to sound cohesive together. And you see how well aligned this stuff is. Now I could have been a little bit better about it, but these left and right tracks sound wider when they're not perfect, right? These things being slightly different here help make the track sound wider than it is.
My word, my bond, resolve is my God!
You can hear there's kind of a slight flam going on there with the vocals. That was intentional. Whereas if we look at the main and the doubles, we go in here, this is all much tighter on purpose because we don't want it to sound like a flam. We want it to sound like one really full vocal. So let's listen to that.
Experience, my fear is what comes of stagnation!
See, that doesn't actually sound like two vocals being played at the same time. It just sounds like one really full, powerful vocal.
Perseverance, my spirit will stake my life on this!
So there we go. So all in all, the edits probably took me an hour or two for all the vocals, all the guitars, all the bass. But this is the most important key aspect of mixing, is getting all of this editing stuff done, because the last thing I want to do is mess with all this stuff while I'm being creative. I don't want to have to go in and like time align some vocals that sound off to my ears while I'm trying to work on getting the reverb to sound good. We're going to knock out all of the objective stuff so that we can just have fun mixing and making the song sound as good as possible. So fix all of the stuff that bothers you and then enhance all of the stuff that makes the song awesome. All right, let's let the fun begin. I've been wanting to do this mix walkthrough for a long time, actually, and I've just been struggling with OBS to understand it and to get it to work properly and record my screen and my microphone and my desktop audio all at the same time. But I made the breakthrough today, so I'm very excited to get this done and to show you guys how I mix a song. So first things first here is we need to talk about monitoring. Now obviously I have headphones on now, and I am monitoring with VSX. You'll see that I'm using the audio file room, and this is what I use for pretty much the entire mix. When I get close to the end of a mix and I'm working on the mastering stuff, I will check it in usually these three: Yellow Matter, Stevens Room, and Archon. And if all of that sounds good, I'll check it in the SUV. And then sometimes I'll check cell phone, but usually I just play it through my phone once I get it onto the Google Drive, and I'll listen to it on my phone throughout the day. But mainly what I'm listening for is, while I'm in the audio file room, right here, yep. While I'm in the audio file room, I'm just listening basically for there to be almost enough low end. I want it to be just a little shy of the amount of low end that I like, because I find that this feels like the flattest room to me, just that the low end always seems like it's a little bit off. And then once the mix is done, I'm gonna go to the SUV, and that should feel like there's a little bit too much low end. So if there's not quite enough in the audio file room, but there's just a little too much in the SUV, that's the sweet spot for me on most mixes. It was on this one for sure. And I could go in here and make some EQ adjustments, but I don't want to mess with anything because I'm really happy with how my mixes come out with VSX. I haven't even upgraded to the new Eco update where it can get even more fine-tuned for your ears. I've just been using the number 2 ear profile, which is supposedly for people with bigger ear canals, which I have. And then just the audio file setting for like 99% of the mix works great for me. I have VSX after what's going to OBS, what's being streamed into OBS. So you're not hearing any of the VSX correction going on. So if you want to hear the mix the way that I'm hearing it, you would also need to have VSX, and you'll need to be on the audio file room. If you don't have VSX, then just listen on whatever your normal listening situation is, right? Whatever your monitors are, or whatever's normal for you, so that you have something to reference while you're listening to this mix. Now let's do an overview really quick before we even get into the audio itself. I have all of these markers up here. Never mind the numbers, that's just kind of the order that they ended up being put in here. But the markers are here to show you where all the transitions are. So this is the intro, this is the intro riff, chorus, transitional piece, you get the idea. So these are included in with your drum MIDI. If you want to see these, you should see it attached to your drum MIDI track. It should show these red lines. So in case you skipped over the initial part of this video and you wanted to get straight to the mixing stuff, I'm just going to very briefly go over my actual mix session, like the template that I have on here, the routing, not necessarily the plugins, but just how things are organized. I'm just going to briefly run through that in case you skipped that first section. So I do everything from the bottom up, so we're going to go bottom up. These are all of the DIs. I didn't actually use the DIs in the mix. I just took them as backup and felt like I didn't need them, but feel free to do whatever you want. And then these were just things that I sent out for the mastering engineer. So you could ignore these gray tracks down here at the very bottom. I have cymbals. I have the close mic, which is just the hi-hat because there's no ride in this song. And then I have the overhead main cymbals, like the crashes and the chinas and stuff. And then the effects cymbals are separate. So the splashes, I think possibly the china. I don't think so though, it's pretty sparse. So you've got the effects cymbals and the main overheads, and then you have the close and far room. All of that is being fed into the all cymbals group. And then we have this bus here for the cymbals, which is basically just crushing the cymbal group, making it a little bit more audible, and blending that in with the more dynamic version of the cymbals. So we're going to get into the details in a second. For the shells, I have things separated by toms, snare, and kick. So under the toms group, you have all of the 2 rack toms and the 3 floor toms. You have those close mics, and you have the overhead and room with the toms, and all of this is just grouped together under the toms group. And I've done the same thing with the snare. You've got the close mics, top and bottom, the overhead and room, and then I have a ghost notes track. And if you zoom in here, there are some parts towards the end of the song where there are ghost notes that I felt like got brought up too high in the mix, so I broke them off onto their own separate track. We've triggered a snare close mic, which is a GGD sample from GGD Slammers, and then we have the Maple Room sample from GGD Slammers. So we'll get into that here just really soon, so just bear with me here. That's it for the snare. The kick is just the sum and the sub, and then overhead and room. All of that goes under all shells, which doesn't have any processing, it's just there for a visual aid. And then all of the drums go under all drums. So the all tracks are red, and that just encompasses everything under that instrument. And then the groups are blue, and then buses or sends are green. We get into bass. We've got 3 different bass tracks depending on if it's a low track, a mid, or a high. And I mean, the low is like the low octave bass lines. The mid is when the bass is playing unison or some sort of harmony that's really close to what the guitar is doing. And then the high is for any time the bass is playing the highest string. So we'll get into why those are separated that way here very soon. All of that's being fed into a subgroup, and that is going into another subgroup and into all bass. Some of this stuff is redundant. and some of it is just to make things clear to me. Like all of these DIs are fed into this, which is effectively like the DI group. And then this is the clean group, and I just wanted to be able to do some volume automation into this virtual mix rack that I had set up, and then that flows into all bass, which has got all of my volume automation and some other fun stuff going on. Now on the guitars, like I said, I didn't end up using the DIs. I just went with what I was getting out of the Kemper, which I believe is a Fryette profile from GGD with one of Buster's IRs. So I think I mix and matched. There. So yeah, we've got a Fryette amp for all of the guitars. So other than the solo is a different amp. I don't remember exactly which profile it was in the Kemper, but all of the rhythms here under main guitars, and then all the rhythms under backing guitars, and these backing guitars here, these are all the same amp profile. Yep, so we just got the solo guitars separate from the rhythm and backing guitars because I wanted to be able to turn the volume up on that without affecting the entire group. So that's separate. And then we have all vocals. And so these 4 gray tracks are the main vocals. We've got the main center, we've got the doubles, and then we have panned left and right vocals with some automation on the panning. Sometimes it's 75, sometimes it's 100, sometimes it's 50. So we've got some different panning going on there. We've got some groups down here where I created some chants by using some clever chorus and reverb effects and stuff like that. I've created some chants. There's a spoken word section. There's some lo-fi stuff. So we've just got some different buses here. Looks like all of them I actually printed out. And then we've got some buses up here that are not printed. So this Vox group was sent to these tracks, and then I placed an effect on it and printed it. This Vox group was also sent to these 3 buses, but I did not print these, and that's why you see automation on them. And right now I've got all of that stuff disabled, but we've got a smash track for the vocals, we've got a short room, and then we've got a long reverb tail. And all of that is flowing into all vocals. We have all the extras, which you just received these right here. So what I have set up is the actual MIDI contact instruments and whatnot under the MIDI section here. And then this is where the audio is actually routed out. So you see the audio is disabled so that I can just program MIDI on these lines. That's what these tracks are MIDI. And then that audio is flowing out of these tracks where I've applied plugins and done some volume changes. So you got what's printed out here without the plugins turned on. Then we've got our mix bus. The mix bus I have on from start to finish. I may make some tweaks to it while I'm mixing, but for the most part, I'm a top-down mixer, and I start with these elements already on. We've got a little bit of a dynamic reduction at around 500K, and a little bump down here at the low end, mostly just because I wanted the Quake bass to stick out in the sub. We've got max volume, which is just set up to bring up the low volume details of the mix. So it's basically limiting the mix and then automating that volume up. And this is all just done with one little slider. I like how convenient that is. We've got a clipper, which is just clipping 2 dB off the mix. And then we have fresh air, which was probably a last minute choice. I was probably finishing up the mix before I sent it to mastering, and I felt it could have been a little bit brighter going into the limiter. So that's on. And then we have the final limiter, which is just adding a little bit of saturation, adding a little bit of low punch, some high-end detail, pretty normal limiting stuff here at the end. We've got some outside mix bus stuff. So here I have the kick and the bass being sent together to this bus outside of the mix bus. So this is not being squashed by the limiter or by any of this processing on the mix bus. And then I just have it set to a level that I like in the mix. Yeah, so this is just the kick and the bass together being smashed by a compressor. And then we have a vocal bus. So this is all vocals being sent also outside the mix bus, so that any compression or any pumping that's being done on the mix bus, there's a version of the vocals that's being blended in that's not affected by any of that. It helps keep the vocals and the kick and bass sitting at a specific level in the mix, being unaffected by any ducking effects that could be happening on the mix bus processing. And then the last track, we have the bass drops. There's a couple in the song, and from the, I don't actually have the sub in the extras group. Usually I have the bass drops in the extras group, and then a portion of that being sent around, just like the vocals and kick and bass. But in this song, I just put the sub outside the mix bus entirely, so that it's not triggering this limiter and only the final limiter on the master bus, which you can see is only really reducing the peak by -1.1. So it's not working all that hard. So you should see that there's not a whole lot of differences to the template that we went over earlier, and that is available on my website if you would like to use this template for any of your mixes. The plugins aren't really the important part. You notice how I didn't really talk about the plugins while discussing the template. It's really just about the color coordination, the organization, having things named a specific way, so that every time I do a mix, everything's in the same place. I know where to find every tool that I want, and all of the routing, all of the sidechain stuff, like none of that has to be set up, or at least very little of it has to be set up. All of my go-to mixing moves are easily available, so that I can just be creative as quickly as possible. So what we're gonna do is we are going to play the mix with all of the plugins turned off that I can. We discussed having a starting place for mixing earlier in the video, and for me, what that means is we're gonna have the vocals muted. I don't work on the vocals until I have the instrumental mix in a good place. We're gonna have the extras muted, because again, that's just the icing on the cake stuff. It adds to an already good mix, so I don't want to hear those elements yet. We're just going to listen to guitars, bass, and drums. And the drums, I have no plugins turned on. You can see all of my effects windows are red, which means everything's disabled. On the bass, the only thing that I have turned on is ToneForge DI Match, and that's because I'm using it to get a specific level out of the DI. The guitars are kind of in the same place as the bass. The only plugins that I have turned on are on the main rhythm left and right guitars. It's ToneForge DI Match, and again, I'm using it to set a specific level for the guitars and for a little bit of tone shaping. The only plugins on the solo guitars are a reverb and a delay, so I'm just going to keep those off for now. So you're just hearing essentially the most basic, bare bones version of this mix. So let's minimize here, because we're going to be starting with drums. Let's just listen to a couple sections of the song with minimal amounts of mixing done, but all of the editing is done. So I'd just say right off the bat, the bass is a little bit loud. The drums aren't really poking through the mix very well. I can hear all the hits fairly well, but it's not very present. And the guitars sound a little bit buried right now. But everything is audible. It's a decent static mix. Listen to a couple other parts. There's also a lot of variety in the frequencies, especially in this riff where there's like a lot going on the bass and the guitar. You can hear certain frequencies kind of resonate more than others and stick out in different places. The guitars and bass definitely need to be more controlled. In this ring out section, you can hear the bass is really pokey, like I'm hearing the initial attack of the pick, and then as the note rings out, it kind of just disappears. So we need to rein in the attack on the bass, and we need to bring up the tail a little bit so you can actually hear it ringing out for the entire duration instead of it kind of just ducking underneath the mix and being lost. It's just the chorus that should play pretty much the same. And you can see there's already some cool panning on the guitars. I like that the guitars kind of have this quacky kind of sound to them, especially when they're in isolation. I kind of like that sound there. I really love this part. If you listen to the bass here by itself, it's going high, low, and the guitars are going low, high, low, high. So it's kind of cool that the bass and the guitars here are playing the same riff, but backwards from each other, and it kind of has this cool harmonized effect when you listen to it together. And then here, when it plays the second time, they swap roles, and the bass goes high-low, and the guitars go low-high. It's kind of cool. Now, if you're listening on any kind of speaker setup or headphones, you're going to hear that low octave bass come in here, and it sounds awesome, but it's a bit overwhelming. So the trick in this mix is going to be to make those low octave sections really punch and sound like, to give it that effect where you kind of want to laugh, like it's so ridiculous. We want to preserve that, but we also don't want to overdo it. We don't want it to make the mix muddy. So it's going to be fun to find a good balance there, right? And then when the solo comes in, the guitars stay the same, but the bass changes back to unison, and it creates room for the solo in a really cool way, where now the mix loses some of its punchiness and loses some of that low end, and it allows you to focus on the top end a little bit more. And I really like how that contrast happens pretty instantly. You can instantly feel how the bottom end of the mix isn't really hitting you in the gut anymore. You're not really feeling it that way, and now all the top end stuff shines in a really nice way that it probably wouldn't if the bass just kept doing the same thing. So always important to think about the mix when you're writing a song and when you're working on bass guitar and guitar parts. Knowing that I was going to put a guitar solo here, I felt it was important to get the bass out of the way because it's not the focal point anymore. When that breakdown comes in, it's really nice that the bass adds this low octave layer to the guitars and makes it really disgusting. And then when the solo comes in, the bass is like, oh, it's your turn, you know, it kind of hands off the song to the solo. So I just really like that part. We also discussed a little bit earlier in the video how when you listen to a mix for the first time, which is what we're simulating right now, right, is we've got all the tracks in, everything's been edited, it's all organized. We have our groups set up, we have our sidechains set up. We might not be actually using every plugin, right? But we have our template ready to go, and we have just enough plugins active to hear everything, right? Once we're at this point and we've just made our first pass through the song, we should be putting down markers, because you don't always get markers with the song. It's nice to know where the chorus is and to be able to jump to it instantly and not have to like search around in the session to find a specific place that you want to listen to. But also, it's important to identify issues as early on as possible, because the more you listen to the mix, the more you sort of fall in love with the mix. And so the first 2 or 3 times you listen through the song, you should be putting down markers indicating and making little notes of things that you want to fix or things that you want to add, like, oh, there should really be a bass drop here, or we need to fix the gating on the guitars in this like choppy section, or the vocals need to be really airy in this part. making those notes early and getting your first impressions down before you really dive into mixing is super important, because you're either A, going to forget it and get wrapped up in other parts of the mix, or B, you're going to get desensitized to the mix and it's just going to sound cool the way that it is, even though at first glance you knew there were things that needed to be fixed or that needed to be enhanced. Most people who listen to a song have no idea all of the stuff that goes into it, right? They didn't write it like you did, and they didn't mix it like I did. So when they listen to the song, they're going to get a first impression. They're not attached to anything that's going on. It just needs to sound good. And so if my first listen through, I go, oh man, it would have been so much better if there was a bass drop right when that part hit, or the cymbals really need to be noisy and in your face in this section. Like, those things really go a long way in keeping the listener interested the first time they listen to the song, so that they come back to it and listen to it more. All right, so we are going to go again from the bottom up. We're going to start with drums and discuss the different decisions that we made during the mix. So let's start by listening to the cymbals in the chorus. Okay, pretty straightforward stuff. The cymbals sound a little bit dry. They're not particularly bright at the moment. So let's take a look at what my first moves were here. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm turning on Soothe. It's getting rid of some of those harsh frequencies between 2 and 8K, and we really want this area to be dominated by the guitars and the vocals depending on the part. So we need to get the harsh resonances from the cymbals out of there. And then we're going to use some EQ. So we're going to get rid of some of the stuff down here, down low, that's just unnecessary. Cymbals don't have anything useful going on down there. And we're going to scoop out some of that mid-range and then turn the track up a little bit. And what this is effectively doing is making the track brighter, because we've removed some of this mid-range information and then we've turned the track up, which is essentially the same as adding a treble boost. And that's kind of an important part of mixing that I want to hit on really quickly, is relativity. You don't always have to make a cut to make a reduction or make a boost to make a boost. That sounds kind of dumb, but by turning down the mid-range and then turning the track up, I've essentially just boosted the low mids and the treble. And you can think of this the same way with compression. If you reduce the peak on, let's say, a snare hit, it's not going to hit you as hard. But if you gain stage it and you now bring the lowered peak of that snare up to where it was before you reduced it, you've essentially just brought up the sustain and the body of the snare instead of reducing the peak. So I think it's interesting that there's such a profound focus on gain staging, especially in like how-to videos and stuff, because sometimes you're applying an EQ or a compressor to get the effect that it's giving you. And if you gain stage, you're getting the opposite effect, right? If I didn't gain stage here, if I don't turn the cymbals up, I'm doing exactly what the EQ shows. I'm scooping the mid-range and removing the low end. But if I then gain stage it up to where the level was before I made those reductions, now the reductions are where they were before I did anything, and the parts I didn't touch are now louder. So just an interesting note that I wanted to touch on. So here's before. Notice how there's more treble, even though I did a mid cut, and it's because I've gain staged. Now lastly, on the main cymbals here is we have a little plug-in chain going. Let's turn them on one at a time, see what we get. Now you can see that I'm kind of in the red here on this mix bus, this virtual mix bus, which is basically just a really subtle effect. It's a channel on a console, right? And it's just set to only really saturate things that go into the red. I would imagine that on the loudest moments of the mix, which cymbal-wise is probably... You can see it's only really getting pinned on the really hard China hits. And that was the point, is to just rein in the dynamic range just a tad with some saturation on the cymbals. Let's go back to that chorus. Again, very subtle. Again, just clearing up a little bit. We're getting rid of some of the really hi-fi stuff around 10K, and we're boosting around 4K. So a little bit more upper mid-range in the cymbals, and then we are making another big cut up to 500 Hertz, just like we did on the digital EQ beforehand. We cut up to 500. So we're just doing that again, and you can really hear it get rid of some of that like washiness underneath the cymbal. Definitely clears things up a bit. Then we have a compressor. It's not doing very much, it's just reducing the very highest peaks. Again, just some very light reduction of the dynamic range. Cymbals can sound crushed really easily. It's so easy to overdo cymbals, so there's not much peak reduction going on here. I have it set to airy because cymbals tend to have an airy character to them. I have the stereo link on, and then we're going into another compressor, but this time we have an external sidechain. And if we hover over the cymbals, you'll see that I'm receiving the snare group. So this is compressing the cymbals whenever the snare hits, and this is to make room for the room sound of the snare. You can see it's just barely doing some reduction whenever the snare hits. You're not hearing the snare because it's just on a sidechain channel, but right, it's very subtle. And then we have a trim just bringing the cymbals down a little bit. So that's all of the cymbals, and then we have this send here. So without it, again, very subtle. It is adding a little bit of excitement to the top end of the cymbals. And you'll see what I'm doing here is I am just crushing the absolute crap out of the cymbals with a clipper. There you go. Now you're just hearing the send by itself. And then the EQ, I'm just bringing it down about 4 dB because that's where I felt that it sat best at 0 on the fader. Okay? And then I'm just boosting up to 2 dB in the parts that I wanted a little bit more excitement out of the cymbals, and just leaving it at 0 in every other part of the song. So this just kind of brings up the overall audible level of the cymbals, and then allows me to add some excitement in the areas that I want it. Now I know we've been soloing the cymbals, but this is actually how I work most of the time when I'm mixing, is I start from the bottom up, and I just start unsoloing stuff as I go. So also there's no bleed because I'm using MIDI drums and I prefer to work without any bleed. So I can listen to just the cymbals and know that it's not going to have any effect on how the shells sound. Each of the toms just have an EQ. That's all they have going on. So let's take a listen to a section that uses most of the toms. Well, it uses all the toms. Cool. Pull this down so you can see it a little better. So, all cymbals, toms group. Cool. We've got a good tom sound to start with already. Let's see what we're doing on the EQ. So for the rack tom, let's just take a listen to it. I'm going to turn the cymbals off for a minute. You can see I'm just cutting right below the fundamental. I'm reducing some of the boxiness around 500. And we're lifting the top end by 6 dB. So we're adding a lot of stick attack, a lot of top end. Definitely makes it more audible. It's not doing anything bad, right? It's just helping the tom sound better. Now let's listen to, see, I used slightly different moves. We're emphasizing slightly different areas. You can see that the fundamental on the second rack tom is just slightly lower, and so I've adjusted that low band to accommodate. And I've moved this just a little bit, just moved it up a little bit. just focusing in on where I think the boxiness of that particular tom is the worst and just reducing it by a little bit. Also didn't feel like this tom needed quite as much top end, so we've just got a boost of about 4 dB as opposed to 6 dB on the first rack tom. So again, just clearing up a lot of the sub that doesn't need to be there, stuff under like 50 Hertz. I want the quake to exist down here as much as possible, the quake and the kick. And we'll check the next tom. Something pretty similar. Again, a reduction there in the boxiness. We've brought the low cut down just a little bit further to accommodate it being a floor tom. Yes, I'm using 3 floor toms and 2 rack toms. And then we've got another 6 dB top boost. Floor toms never have enough stick attack, so we gave it a little bit more. Floor tom 2. Very, very similar. Nothing crazy going on here. And then the left floor tom. Right? So that's what we're doing to the close mics on all the toms. The overheads, right here, are being cut around 50. So we're not getting rid of all the low end and the overheads for the toms. So you notice if I were to have bleed, if I were to have toms in the actual overhead and room tracks, I wouldn't be able to do this because I cut the cymbals up to 500, and that would be cutting all of the low end of the toms out of the overheads. So that's why I like working without bleed. We can do cool creative things like this that you wouldn't be able to do in a real situation. And we've got a little bit of a reduction in the mid-range. The room just has a nice gentle roll-off so that there's still some existing sub. I do like the low-end thump of toms and kicks in room tracks, but not a lot, just a little bit. So I'm not using a really steep cut there. Again, another reduction here in the mid-range, and then a top boost. So let's listen to the toms without any of that. And with. So a little more smacky, right? A little more top end. The low end and the low mid range is controlled a little bit better. And then that's all feeding into a toms group. The toms group is adding a pretty significant amount of top end. So we're gonna listen to that here. Definitely more exciting sounding. Really clearing up what's left of that murky low mid, especially on the floor toms. It's really helping a lot. And then we were feeding that into virtual mix rack, and I use this chain on all of my shells. So tom, snare, and kick are all going to have this identical chain, maybe with the settings a bit different, but I do things in this order because it solves problems in a way that I like. So first up, we are using a gate on the toms. Now there's no bleed, so there's nothing to gate out of the toms, but using a gate on a drum has a sound, and we like that sound, at least I do. So what I'm doing is I'm setting the release time on this gate to about 1 second. That's enough to not really remove all of the tail. It leaves a little something. I have debleed turned off, and I'm using the tom overhead as a send to the side chain here. So it's actually listening to the overhead because it's really spiky, and it's using that to determine when to gate the toms. So it's not really all that complicated, but you can see my automation here. Basically, anytime I want to make the toms a little bit tighter, we bring the milliseconds down. And anytime we want some ring out of the toms, we bring the release up to a higher value. So this allows us to do things like, we've got this little part here. See how little sustain there is? See how long that rings out all the way to the transition moment? Now it sounds kind of dead. So you could use this to stop ring. Like let's say I have a part that starts right here, and I don't want to ring over the first kick drum hit of that part, right? We could just do this. Instantly kill it, and the kick will come in, and in the context of the mix, you're not going to hear that cut to the sustain of the toms. Now, going that far wasn't necessary here on this song, but you can see there are parts where the toms are really tight for like faster rolls, and then where they're looser for like those big, wide tom hits. So you can get really extreme with it in the fast sections if you need to. Now, coming out of that gate, we're hitting the virtual mix bus just like we did with the cymbals, and again, we should just be kissing the top of the red during the heaviest hitting moments, which should be right about here. See, just barely hitting the red, only on those really hard tom hits. Then we have an EQ, boosting some 4K, boosting some 10K. So just getting a little more stick attack, a little bit more hi-fi out of the toms. We're reducing that boxy 400 area. And then we just have a low cut at 40 hertz, just to rein in the sub a little bit. We're definitely not killing the sub on the toms, but we're just trying to clear out as much low-end energy as possible so that when we get to the Quake bass, it can fill its role as best as possible. Then we move on to two compressors. These don't have an external sidechain. Instead, what I'm doing is I'm hitting them fairly hard, somewhere between like 5 to 8 decibels of reduction, and then I'm mixing it around 50%. Now, this distressor is set to a really fast attack time, and then just an appropriate release time that I felt for the material. And then this custom opto is set to be a little bit slower. So we've got some fast compression, some slow compression, both at a level that you generally would be excessive on its own. So that's why we're blending it in to preserve some of the dynamics, because this is a MIDI drum kit, right? It's already going to be less dynamic than a real player would be, because we're really picky about the velocities and making everything sound perfect. We don't need to slam a compressor. We can slam it to get the character that we want, and then we can dial back that blend to retain some of the dynamics that we worked so hard on in the humanization phase of the MIDI. So here we go. I must have at some point decided that the distressor character wasn't really needed, and so I dialed it back so that I could hit the opto hard instead. But both are blended in at about 50%. Again, it's reducing the initial hit of the drum a little bit and then bringing up the sustain so that you're actually hearing the entirety of the drum better. Instead of hearing it poke through and then die away and you're not really getting the body of the tom, now you're getting a little bit less of the initial hit and hearing more of the body, so that the actual balance is better in the context of the mix. Lastly, we have a clipper. And let's see what we've got here. Let's see where we're at before the clipper. Peaking at around -6. Still peaking at around -6. So the whole idea here was that I clipped the toms really hard and then gain staged them, right? I added 12 dB and removed 8, but somehow ended up at the same place. I love clipping on drums. It really brings out the character and gets rid of the excessive pokiness that you really don't need out of the drum. So this is a great move. I do this on pretty much all of the shells. I think you're going to see similar moves on the snare and the kick. So using that clipper really just helps make the toms more audible, and it helps you hear it in the context of other things playing without actually adding any energy to the mix and hitting that mix bus even harder. Because we saw when we initially set up the mix, that mix bus was being hit just like 1 or 2 dB on that final limiter, and that's where we want to be at the end of the mix too. I don't want to get to the end of the mix and find that I've been slamming the limiter at like 8 the whole time, right? We want to gain stage things and stay right in this pocket where we know the mix is going to sound great. So this was a good move to get the toms to come up in the mix without actually bringing the peak level up. Now we've got the snare. Let's listen to the snare in the chorus. Let's do snare, toms, simples. And maybe we can go. Maybe there's a part with some snare and some toms. We can go here. So we've got the ghost notes pulled off onto their own track. So let's check that out. Right, it's just to keep the ghost notes being subtle. We don't need it to be brought up in the mix the same way that the main snare hits are. Now let's check out. We've got EQ on each of these tracks. All right, so here's the snare top. Let's take a listen to that. Just getting rid of some of that quacky mid-range and reducing some information below the fundamental that's not needed, adding a little bit of stick attack. You can see there's a bit of a theme here. Or let's just listen to the snare bottom on its own. Let's do that first. We've got some different moves here, right? Much steeper roll off on the low end, because really we're just looking for the bead sound out of the snare bottom. Right? We just don't want it to be competing with other mid-range information. Like the snare bottom is fairly unimportant to me. I do want to be able to hear it, but I don't want it to get in the way of anything. So that's why I have limited the EQ on it so much on both sides. It made it very narrow sounding. And together we get this. Right, so we got rid of some of that hollow sounding, like mushy, low mid stuff, and brought out the stick attack a little bit. Now let's take a listen to the overhead. Let's go here. Overhead has just got a little bit of a reduction in the boxy 500, 600 area. Nothing crazy, pretty subtle move there. And then we've got the snare room. Again, just getting rid of some of that boxy 500-ish stuff. And it looks like this top boost is disabled. And then we're rolling off everything under about 200. Just really makes it sound not as boxy. That's really all that's really doing. So let's take a listen to all of this stuff. Cool. It's a little bit brighter. It's a little more audible. No huge moves there, right? We've also got these two triggers. So let's take a listen to the close. Let's mute the cymbals again, toms. Obviously this is a one shot, so let's take a look at that. We are using Glorious Floater from GGD Slammers. And yep, it's a one shot, so it only has one velocity, and I just have it blended into a level that I feel is appropriate. And you can see there's this little +1. At some point I decided to bring it up a little bit. Let's listen to the snare with and without it. Just makes it hit a little bit harder, keeps it a little bit more consistent. Once we actually get the mix going with the guitars and stuff, it's going to help keep the snare floating above the mix where we want it. And then lastly, we have this snare room, which is the Maple Slam room. Again, GGD Slammers. Very snappy. It's got a really nice, impactful top end. And let's hear that with the close mic. And let's hear it with everything. Cool. So definitely sounding better. Let's turn everything off and on. You notice a significant reduction in the low mid-range and in just the lows in general. The snare doesn't need to have that much low-end energy, in my opinion, at least not in this song. We want the bass to take care of that job, and we want the kick to take care of that job. So we're making room for those things to be bigger. Now on the snare group, you're going to see another brightness increase with fresh air. And then we're going into that same plug-in chain that we had on the toms, but you'll see I have the gate disabled and I don't have any automation, so I must have felt that it wasn't necessary. We did a good job humanizing the snare and getting things to hit and sustain the way that they need to. I must have just gotten the job done mainly with humanization and with compression, so I could effectively just turn this off. We're going into this mix bus, so let's do this. Right, that's not a super hard-hitting section. We could go here. Yep, just kissing the red on the really hard flams. Now here, we've got a reduction around 400, and I really just like the curves, the EQ curves in this EQ in particular. The custom series EQ, I've just gotten really accustomed to the way these knobs sound when they're turned up and down, and it just happens to be a cool sound in my opinion for drums. And then we just have a really tiny cut to the sub here at 35. Again, subtle, just leaving room for there to be more low end in other elements of the mix. And then we have both of these set to insert internal, so there's no external side chaining going on here. You could see on that flam we were hitting around -6. -8 even, -8. And then this opto isn't doing quite as much work now. It's just kind of keeping the RMS, like the average level of the snare, in a good place. And again, both set to about 50% mix, so that we're not completely destroying the dynamics that we worked hard for with the MIDI programming. So there is the snare. Now let's talk about the kick. Again, you're going to see a lot of similar moves. Let's listen to it by itself. A fairly loose sounding kick to start with, in my opinion. But let's move over to the sum and the sub. So the sum has just got a cut around 40 Hertz, and then a dynamic reduction around 170, which is probably where that resonant peak is for the fundamental. So whatever the fundamental frequency is of the kick, usually if you double or quadruple it, like so if it's a 50 Hertz kick drum, usually around 100 and around 200 is where you're going to find some build-up frequencies that can sound boxy in the mix. It can sound cool depending on the song. Like there are some bands like Knocked Loose, Alpha Wolf immediately come to mind. They have that kind of thuddy sounding kick drum on some of their albums. I'm not usually a big fan of that, so I'll use some dynamic reduction there to get rid of it only when it builds up. So let's see. Subtle. It's not doing a whole lot. Listen to the sub here, which is just the sub that routes out from Invasion. And again, just a cut at 25, which is probably not doing much at all, and then a reduction around 100, because that's the doubled fundamental. Oops. There, you could really hear the body and the low end punch of the kick drum now. Nothing crazy, nothing crazy. Definitely more subtle moves on the kick drum here than we saw on the snare and the toms. And let's take a listen to the overhead. Let's reduce that, okay. Let's listen to it. Now, I don't know about you, but even just looking at the meter, I can tell it's slightly panned to the right. And I don't know why the kick is like that in Invasion. It's probably just the way that the room recorded it. So I have S1 Imager on here, correcting that. You can even see the meters are more even. It's still Still a little favors the right side, but if you do too much of this correction, it can sound kind of phasey or like blurry. So it's just there to very minimally correct that problem. In the context of the mix, probably not a huge difference, but we want to monoify the low end of the kick drum as much as possible. And you'll see that there is some low end in the overhead. I didn't completely nuke it like I did with the cymbals. So again, one of the benefits of removing or reducing bleed with MIDI drums is that you can get really picky about what you cut and what you boost, because it's not going to affect things that you don't want it to affect. So we've got that imager kind of centering the overhead image a little bit better, and then we're just reducing some sub low end. We're getting that sub out of the actual sub track. We don't need it in the overhead. Reducing that same 170 that we were reducing in the kick sum, boosting again a little bit of top end, the clicky sound of the kick. So let's listen to that before and after. You can kind of hear the air of the room a little bit better. And then let's move over to the kick room. Now, I generally don't use a lot of kick room. I usually like the kick to be tight, but you can see there are certain areas of the song where I boosted it by 12 dB, and that's because at 0, you're not hearing it in the mix at all. Plus 12 was about what it took for me to actually hear the room kind of bloom around the close mic. So that's why it's so exaggerated. It might as well be muted in all of these unautomated sections. You're hearing it in isolation, but in the context of the mix, it's basically not there. So you're not really hearing that sound at all. We've got a dynamic reduction again at 170, and then we've got another reduction around 400 or so, probably just getting rid of some muddy stuff, and then just a 60 hertz cut, because again, we don't need a ton of low end out of the room, but I do like that pillowy low end. I like some low end of the kick to be present in the room, let's say. So before and after. You can kind of hear that like quacky, like low mid phasiness is reduced. You can't even really hear it anymore, which is really, really nice. So it doesn't sound quite as deep, but once we get all of the tracks playing together, it's not going to matter anymore. And like I said, you're not really hearing that room very much. So let's move over to this section where you do. Yeah. Punchy. Without it. It's got that kind of arena rock, pillowy kick sound to it, which I dig. And now we'll move over to the group processing. So let's grab that. Oh, my bad. Don't want to miss the one trigger that we have. Again, using the overhead to trigger. And we've got this clippy mids close kick from GGD Slammers. And we've got the dynamics completely reduced. So it's a one shot. It's just playing very, very consistently. And then we are removing everything up to 1K. So we're not using this for low end. We're just using it for the clippy kind of kick sound, right? So let's listen to that in context. I definitely hear it punch through a little bit. Let's try somewhere without the room. Let's go here. Nice. Just adding more consistency to the top end of the kick. You know, I don't want it to really poke out of the mix a lot. This isn't like a death metal song where you want the really highly clicky back and forth kick sound. I just want it audible enough that you can tell where every kick hits, even when the song gets busy, but I don't want it to be distracting. And now we can take a look at that kick group. We've got Fresh Air, again boosting, but mainly boosting the highs. So let's check that out really quick. definitely more slappy. You're hearing a lot more of that trigger, I think. Nice, just a little bit of top end excitement. We've got the gate, which we are automating on the kick. You can see in some places we've got it set really extreme, all the way down to 50, like right here. Let's turn this on. Very extreme. Getting rid of all of the sustain because there's just a lot going on in the chorus. There's a lot of guitars, there's some risers going on in the background, there's a lot of vocals going on. We don't need the kick to be the focal. So in the really, really busy sections, I've cut out as much sustain from the kick as I could, but you get the idea. I'm automating when there can be a tail on the kick and when there can't be. So in the places where there's space, I'm automating that gate to be more transparent, and in the parts where there's a lot of speed or a lot of busy stuff going on, I'm making the gate faster. So, and then again, we are just kissing into the red on this virtual mix bus here. The ending breakdown has the hardest hitting kick section, so let's try that. Yep, kiss in the red. But the other parts are just in the red. So that's what we want, just the hardest hits to get saturated. Now we are adding some 4K. You know, 10K, this top knob, it tends to be where like the top end of the click is really at, especially from that trigger that we added. But 4K is where it kind of has this like meaty top end thing going on. I'll push it to the extreme and let you hear it. The 10K sounds kind of hi-fi, whereas the 4K, it just cuts through better and it doesn't sound quite as annoying to me. And then again, removing that pesky 400 from the kick drum, and then just setting this low cut to 35. Very, very subtle. Again, just trying to emphasize the click and trying to keep that low end punchy, which means getting rid of some of those boxy frequencies. Now here, I get no side chaining on the kick here. And this is more what my parallel compression on shells typically looks like. About 6 dB of reduction on a fast comp, and then about 6 dB reduction on a slow one, both set to about 50 on the mix knob. Let's try a busier section here. You hear all that low-end energy that's being removed by the gate here. That's intentional, so that the bass guitar can carry the low end instead of the kick. And then there are parts in the song like this, where the kick is allowed to slap, right? Where it's allowed to be really upfront. But again, the sub-frequencies are mainly being carried by the bass guitar, which you'll see once we get into that. That's what we're gonna hit next. So we've went through all of the individual groups. The only thing that's left is the all drums. So all of the shells and cymbals are being fed into all drums. Let's go back to the chorus since we've spent the most time there. The first thing we have is multipass. Now, if you've ever watched any of Buster Oldholm's videos, you see the trick that he likes to use with Saturn on his drums. And he'll do this on every shell, on the cymbals, and then on the mix bus, the drum bus. Basically, he's using distortion on a multiband plugin like Saturn to apply various amounts of distortion to different EQ bands. Now, I don't have Saturn, and I didn't want to buy Saturn to do one little trick, but I do have the Slate subscription. So instead, I'm using multipass, and I'm using a little saturation module, and I have the spectrum broken up into 5 different bands. You've got 20 to 150, 150 to 750, 750 to 3K, 3K to 10, and then everything above 10K. And essentially what I'm doing is I'm listening to the drums. So let's turn this stuff off really quick. Let's just listen to the chorus again. Okay, and what I'm doing is, let me load up a brand new instance of multipass. And I'll just walk you through what my thinking is here. Okay, so let's go to my preset right here, 250. What were we at? 150, 750, and 3K. 750 and 3K. And then this was set to about 10. Okay. So what we're looking for is we're going to solo the first band. We're going to listen. And we're going to apply as much drive as we can. We're going to distort the low end of the drum set as much as possible before it sounds like crap. So let's try this. We kind of just wait until that crunchiness from the distortion goes away. At about -11 is where I heard it. Cool. Move on to the next. Again, around about 10 there, felt right to me. That feels good. About there. Okay, you can also play with the dynamics knobs because they could really make some big changes. But let's listen to what we have here as a whole. It's probably going to be loud, just a warning. As opposed to this. Now let me gain stage this a little bit. Trying to get the top end in the same place. And what it does is that distortion really, it sinks the shells into the mix a little bit in a really pleasant way. It stops the snare and the kick and the toms from being like overly pokey. And I really love that it can sync stuff into a mix as far as the transients go, but still keep it audible in the mix as far as like the EQ goes. So it's kind of a weird description, but I like what this trick does to drums, and now I can't stop myself from doing it on every mix. So here are the final settings that I ended up with. It really makes the low end of the kick a lot more consistent. It makes the snare hits more consistent. It makes the cymbals a little bit more sizzly, but in a pleasant way, in my opinion. I think the saturate module does a good job of distorting things in a way that's pleasant and not harsh. So, especially if you go about it the way I did, where you're just introducing as much drive as possible before the audio starts to fall apart. And then I'm just using these gain knobs to gain stage afterwards, because usually you're going to have too much top end after you distort every single band. That's mainly what it's doing, is bringing out all of the harmonic content and making each band sound brighter. So you may need to compensate a little bit with these gain knobs. But my last move here on drums was Finality Advanced, which is just doing some limiting. So let's see where we're at volume-wise before the limiter. Somewhere around -9. Basically just keeping me pinned at -8, and then I brought it up by 1 dB. So I'm just barely taking the edge, barely taking the highest peaks off of the drum kit and then compensating for it. So again, I'm not actually reducing the peak of the drum kit. I'm not actually making the hardest hits quieter. Because I'm turning it up by the same amount, those peaks are going back to where they originally started, and it's bringing up all of the low volume information actually. So just another way to think about that relativity in mixing that I touched on earlier, that if you squash something a little bit with a limiter and then gain stage it and bring it up by the amount that you reduced it, Now you've brought your peak back up to its original starting point and brought up all of the quiet stuff by that amount. So that was the approach here at the very end of the drum mixing. Alrighty, it's a new day. I'm wearing a different shirt because this stuff took way longer than I thought it was going to. I've never done a video like this. Hopefully after editing we can cut some time down a little bit. But we're going to move on to the bass, and you can see here that I've got 3 different tracks for the DI, and I've kind of cut the DI into pieces and moved it around, and this is my way of automating some different bass tones. The problem I always run into with bass is that the lowest string always is lacking in pick attack compared to the rest of the bass, and then the higher strings are always way more audible, right? So we need some processing to kind of even out the bass so that no matter where the bass is being played, no matter what register we're in, there's some similarity between those different registers so that we're not piling on plugins for just specific sections of the song. If I'm playing the low octave, for example, on the low track, if I have it on the mid, I find that there's just not enough pick attack because the lowest string is just a lot bigger. It's a lot more round sounding, but we want a certain level of pick attack in the mix, right? So I can move those low sections to this DI low track and give it some extra pick attack only for those parts. And then the opposite is true for this high section. I'm reducing some of the high end and increasing some of the low end to make it a little more similar to the rest of the bass. And you'll see as we go along here how important that is in getting the bass sound on this song. So let's start with the mid track here, and we'll go back to the chorus since we've listened to that quite a bit. So this is with no processing. It's got a really throaty sound to it, like there's a lot of low mid stuff going on, especially in this chorus part where I'm not really playing low on the bass. So let's listen to with and without. You can already hear it adding some of that 100 hertz and reducing some of that low mid. It sounds a little bit less congested now. And if we take a look at the EQ, we're reducing some of that boxiness by about 2.5 dB, and then some dynamic reducing even further just based on the signal. And then we've got a little bit of a bump down here, just under 100 hertz, and a cut at 70. So this is just kind of to reinforce the lowest notes on the bass, and then removing some of that low mid buildup, just like we did on the kick drum. And you can tell it's really freeing up some real estate there in the low mids. And I do really like to do dynamic processing whenever possible, because you're not always playing the same notes, you're not always in the same place. Unless it's like a really chuggy song where someone's just like playing the lowest 5 frets on the guitar and the bass most of the song, you're probably going to want to do some dynamic processing so that as the signal changes, the EQ adapts. We're going to move on to the Shadow Hills, and I love using this on bass, or really just anything with low end. I think it has a really nice character for a compressor. And you'll see here in this window the optical compression, and in this window you're going to see the discrete compression. And we'll listen to that really quick. Now the optical compression is pretty slow. It's letting a decent amount of the transient through, whereas the discrete is really fast and it's catching a lot of that transient. So I'm pushing pretty hard into the opto, but we're only maxing it around -2 dB on the discrete because I don't want to get rid of too much dynamics. I do want to rein in that dynamic range a little bit and then gain stage afterwards. That way we're bringing up all of that low volume information, but we don't want to squash things completely. So let's listen to like a choppier section. Let's try this ending part. Let's listen to this. Definitely making the bass less pokey, and in the sections where the bass is ringing out quite a bit, like here, And you can even tell just looking at the DI waveform. The second and third hit there, I definitely hit it really hard with the pick. And the first and the fourth hit are a little bit quieter, and so this is evening out the pick attack on sections like this and bringing up the sustain. It is nice that it's kind of reducing the pokiness there. It's making things a little bit smoother, but not flattening the signal entirely. And then we have Soothe doing what Soothe does. It's basically, in this context, just removing some of the mid-range resonances so that there's a little more room for the guitars to exist. And then we are clipping. So let's try Soothe on and off really quick. We'll go back to the chorus. This is a pretty subtle move here, but getting rid of those resonances, again, is a nice dynamic way to make some space for other things. And as the signal changes, Soothe is going to adapt. So it's not just putting a static cut on the bass. It's listening to the bass and applying that cut based on the signal. And I do like that kind of processing whenever possible, or whenever it's appropriate. Let's take a look at where we're at level-wise at this point. Let's try here. On average, we're around -9, -10. So this clipper is adding 6 dB of gain and then removing 12. So at some point it probably was matched. It was probably adding 6 and then removing 6 just to cut some of that transient off. But I probably at some point decided to turn the bass down a little bit, and I decided to do it on the last plugin, like I like to do. Instead of messing with the faders, I like to leave the faders for the end of the mix when I'm making small tweaks. So I was probably in the middle of the mix and decided the bass was way too loud. Now let's move over to the low section. There's only a few pieces of audio here, but we'll look at the differences. So the ToneForge DI match, we'll listen to that really quick. Again, I think this is pretty subtle. At 70% on the spectral match, it's not changing a whole lot. It is adding a little bit more low end. That's really about it though. The EQ is significantly different on this low track because, like I said, the low string is like a 260 gauge string, so there's not a whole lot of pick attack. So what I'm doing is I'm boosting by 6 dB at 5K, and then I'm boosting a lot more, but in a controlled way with a dynamic EQ filter here. We've also just got a nice smooth cut around 500. And then we have a dynamic cut right here around, what is that, 150? Let's try this section. It's got some actual pick attack to it. Let's listen to this. Definitely a lot more pick attack, a lot more top end. But there's so much low end on the low octave, on the lowest string of the Quake, that adding more top end like this, even though it's pretty excessive, is just making the signal more balanced to my ears. Now from here, we've got Shadow Hills. I'm gonna assume it's probably doing the same type of reduction that it was doing on the mid track. Pretty similar setup. Now it is being hit harder, but that's because these lower notes just have more energy to them, right? There's a lot of low end there, a lot of sub, takes up a lot of energy, and it makes it hit the compressor harder. But that's kind of what I'm going for, right? We're trying to even out the discrepancies in the different registers of the bass so that the bass as a whole is consistently audible while the song plays. Now we've got Soothe, again just doing the same thing, making room in the mid-range. And then we've got a clipper, again doing +6 and then -12 on the trim. Let's see where we're at level-wise. Yep. And that's about where we were on the mid track as well. Let's go back to, let's say, this section. Yep, see, right around -12 still. Now let's check the one high section. I love this riff. This is the riff that started the song. We had this on, I wrote this riff on the guitar and jammed it for several weeks, and then I decided to record it, and within 2 days I had recorded this entire song. That's why I used the Kemper tracks. I was really feeling this. I really enjoyed writing this song, and this is the riff that started it all. Cool. So you're hearing with, let's hear without. And this is nice too because it's giving us a nice bump right around 150, 170. And then there's this nice cut. And the bass kind of has this like quacky, like strong low mid-range presence to begin with. So this cut around 500 is really nice. It kind of clears up that throaty sound of the bass, which I do like, but only so much of it. I don't want it to be overwhelming. On this EQ, we're a bit simpler. We're just making a reduction at 1K, and then reducing it a little bit more with some more dynamic, and then I cut around 80. Really clearing up that quackiness to the mid-range even further. Shadow Hills again. Again, just reining in the pokiness of the bass so that it sits a little bit better with the kick drum. Removing some more 1K. And then a clipper. Looks like I added half a dB, to the high section for whatever reason. I think I really, since this was the riff that started it all, I think I wanted the bass to pop out a little bit more and feel more on par with the level of the guitars in this section. And we will get to guitars here shortly. I'm just kind of doing things the way that I would when I start a mix. I get the drums mixed, then I add the bass and get it to sound good, add the guitars till it sounds good, add the vocals, and then I skip around a little bit. And of course, if I hear something specifically, I'll go out of order if it means fixing a problem and then not having to hang on to that thought and fix it later. But for the most part, this is my workflow. Now on the group above the DI, we've just got finality advanced, just doing some limiting. And remember, we were right around like -15, -12. We kind of had like a 3 dB range depending on where we're at on the bass. And so this limiter being set to -17 is cutting anywhere from, 2 to 4 or 5 dB off of the peak. So let's take a listen to that. And we'll listen to that riff again. See, just doing a little bit of reduction, about -1. Let's try this heavier breakdown at the end. Yeah, nothing crazy there, just chopping off some peaks. And then on the next group above that, and again, this is just for organization and for automation, right? I could have easily put the virtual mix rack on this group and just gotten rid of this one. I could have easily combined all 3 of these grouped tracks into one track instead of having this kind of stair step thing going on here. But just in case I want to do some automation going into the mix rack, I have left that option open to myself, and I did use it here at the very end when the guitar solo comes in to make the bass come down a little bit going into this mix rack plug-in chain. So there's less compression on the bass overall when the solo comes in. And then you can see I have some automation on the next track up and some automation on the all bass track as well. So mainly I'm just leaving room to automate the volumes in between certain plugins. So let's take a listen to the chorus, and we'll go one at a time here. So first we've got a distressor. We've got it set with a fairly slow attack for a distressor and a quick release. So we're letting some transient through and just controlling the level of the quake even further. And again, doing the mix knob at around 50% because I like to keep some dynamics intact and run things in parallel whenever it's appropriate. Then we've got a trimmer, bringing things down. And then we're adding a ton of top end here, 3 dB at 7K, 4 dB at 10K, removing some more of the boxy mid-range, and then just a cut at 20 Hertz. So let's listen to that. Let's listen to it in isolation. Let's try this section. Sounds like taking a blanket off the bass, and it makes it sound a little bit stringier too, which in the context of the guitars is going to make it more audible. Then we've got some more compression. This one is set up to just be extremely fast. We're just catching as much peak as possible, super fast release, and then gain staging again a little bit. And this is probably me mid-mix. I probably put the distressor, the trimmer, and the EQ on there, and then I got to a certain point and went, there needs to be a little bit more compression. And then I probably reached a point where I went, I want half a dB more of the bass. And so you're kind of just seeing moves that happened at different times, all right next to each other. That is flowing into the last two plugins. We've got multipass on there, and we're doing the same trick that I did on drums, but on the bass guitar. The only difference being that I muted everything above 5K on the bass. I wanted everything above 5K, roughly speaking, to be cymbals, to be top end of the vocals, to be the risers and the extra effects that we've added that we'll get to at the end of the mix. And then this last thing is a tape stop plugin from Kilohertz, and let's see, you can hear it right at the very end of the song. Kind of hear it. It's a very cool effect. I use it on guitars at a different point in the song as well, so you're gonna get to hear that soon. Overall, we're at a good place. Things are punchy. Let's get the guitars in there and see how those sit without any processing. Let's just go right back to the chorus, since we should be pretty familiar with that part of the song at this point. Cool. So we've got a couple different things happening here. We've got main guitars. This is like up at the 22nd, 23rd fret area on the fretboard. And then we have this. Cool. So we got some strummy stuff going on in the background, and we need to make those parts play nice. We've also got some sections of the guitar that are just single tracked, and that's because I kind of had a vision for the song while I was in the middle of writing, and I knew that there were certain parts that I wanted to be center, and it saved me some time recording because those parts I knew I didn't need to double track. That's just single tracked because that's just a money riff. I wanted it to be really tight, and I wanted it to be narrow sounding compared to those strummed guitars. We've got the actual intro here on the backing guitars. So at the beginning of the song, I just kind of have this single track down the center, nice and narrow and kind of murky sounding, and then when the full song comes in, you get to hear it double tracked. And it's like, again, taking the blanket off the guitars and making them shine. So let's take a look at the main guitars first. Now the mains, we're going to go to the chorus. The mains have Tone Forge DI on, and I'm using, this is a profile of the bridge pickup on my Maslow. It doesn't have a neck pickup. And this is going into a Fryette amp profile on the Kemper. And then I'm just taking an EQ profile of that after the cab, and I'm applying this EQ curve because I really like the sound of the Fryette, and again using the level match feature so that the guitars are at the same level that they're always at in every mix that I do. And that's all I have on the main track. So let's listen to this single guitar here. I'll put it center really quick. It's kind of just doing the opposite of what I was doing on the Quake, right? This is making the mid-range sound a little bit more congested, a little bit more nasally. And I think that that helps give the guitars more of an identity in comparison to the bass. We tried to make the bass sound as clear as possible. So that was kind of my thinking there. Let's see. That panning back. And again, you can see on the right guitar, it's the same exact processing. And I know there's a lot of people who are a fan of doing different guitar tones on the left and right. I personally can't stand that. There are some mixes that do have that I think sound wonderful. But when I'm working on a mix, I always find that I think it feels lopsided if the left and the right guitars are too different. And it's easier to make things sound tight as a guitar player when the amp is the same, because different amps react differently to your playing. And I don't want to spend all of that extra time trying to get my playing to sound consistent through different amps. So I'll just use the same amplifier, and then if I really feel like the tones on the left and right need to be different, I'll do that with EQ, or I'll do that by reamping the DI or something afterwards. But again, even with reamping a DI, you run into that same problem where when you're a guitar player and you're playing through a rig, you're reacting to that rig while you're playing, right? And depending on how the amp reacts to you, you're going to react to it differently, and there's this feedback loop while you're playing guitar. When you take a DI and you reamp it, you're kind of losing that attachment that the guitar player had to the amp, and you kind of have to find settings on the amp sim that closely resemble the way that that original amp reacted, so that you can get the pick attack and the sustain and the different characteristics that the guitar player was looking for originally. And honestly, I just find it can be a nightmare, especially if the guitar player's picky. I almost always like the guitar tones that I get while I'm playing more than the ones that I get while I'm reamping for myself personally, because in that moment I'm playing into the amp and the amp is playing back to me, and that feedback loop is what makes the amp feel good while you're playing, not just sound good. So I'll move on from there. But on the main guitars bus here, we've got 3 plugins. We've got an EQ with a few different moves, right? We've got a pretty gentle slope at 100 Hertz. We've got a pretty significant cut around 400 at -5 dB. And then we've got this nice gentle slope in the mid-range and a nice boost on the top end, 2.5 dB, right around 3.5K and up. We've got a nice shelf there. So I'll let you listen to that. Let's go. Yeah, we'll do full mix. So it's really clearing up some space there. I know we said we wanted a congested mid-range, but I probably felt like it needed to be reined in a little bit, and we needed a little bit more top end on the guitars to cut through the cymbal wash and to cut through vocals once they're put in. Then we've got Soothe, which is really just clamping down on the palm mutes, like the low end information down here. It's not getting rid of it entirely, but anytime it gets resonant and like overly, that low end just becomes a bit overwhelming, it's gonna push that down. And then we're clearing up a little bit of space up around 4K because we boosted quite a bit with the previous EQ. Let's try maybe a chuggier section of some sort. Let's see what we got here. In the context of the mix, that's pretty subtle. And then we have that tape stop effect. Let me see, where did I put that at? I think it was right here. Nice. Just some ear candy to make that transition sound a little bit more fun, so that on the first listen somebody gets to that part and they go, oh whoa, what was that, you know? Not necessary, but I just thought it was a fun sound, and it helps bridge that transition a little bit better and kind of excite the listener. Now, the guitar tones, this main guitar, I can tell is the Fryette amp, and the backing guitars, I believe, are the Fort and Meshuggah profile in the Kemper. So both using the Kemper, just using two different guitar tones, and they're the ones that I use all the time. I think I have maybe 6 presets in the Kemper. 3 of them are the GGD Fryette amp with a Buster IR, and 3 of them are Fort and Meshuggah profile with various cabs, I think maybe some GGD stuff. But those are the 2 amp sounds that I just can't get away from. So moving to the backing guitars, on the center only tracks, like at the beginning, I have side widener turned on, and that just basically makes the mono signal sound a little bit more stereo. And when it's collapsed to mono, like on a cell phone, there's no artifacts or anything. It's really cool. If I switch the mix over to mono, it sounds like you're just turning the side widener plugin on bypass. So it's a really cool widening plugin that just doesn't leave any artifacts when the mix is playing in mono. So I'll let you take a listen to that really quick. And I just thought it was a nice texture there, especially because this intro guitar is single tracked and then it goes into a double tracked, brighter version. I felt like just going strictly from mono to full stereo was a little bit jarring, and so this side widener kind of adds a little bit of air at the beginning and makes that transition to double tracked guitars sound a little bit smoother. And then we've also got it here on this center track. Ah, that riff is so cool. I love it. So there's just that center track. It's all we have going on there. And then on these backing guitars, I have no plugins. Again, just because I'm really happy with the guitar tone. It's a guitar tone I'm very familiar with. I know that I like it at the end. It's almost entirely mix ready. So let's take a listen. Yeah, together those just sound awesome. Yeah, nothing wrong with that. And then on the backing guitars bus, we have some EQ going on. And it looks like I'm cutting really hard at 300. So everything under 300 is being removed from the backing guitars, which is fine because all of these backing guitars are strumming parts. They're kind of lead parts. Like none of this is chuggy low string stuff. That's all done by the main guitars. So this allows the palm mutes and all of the low mid information in the main guitars to have some room to breathe, especially because we removed a lot of like 400 or 500 out of the bass guitar. So this is just creating a place for the backing guitars. Even though in isolation they'd probably sound way better without this cut. Let's take a listen. Honestly, no, it just sounds way better. It sounds way tighter. It's getting rid of just unnecessary rumbly stuff. Again, because I'm not playing low on the guitars in this section. Let's try this. Yeah, it's removing so much noise and stuff going on underneath the guitar that just doesn't need to be there. And then we have this final backing guitars. So originally, when I recorded this song, I made a demo where I just single tracked the guitars all the way through. And that's what these 4 little takes are, is I really just liked the performance and the approach to these 4 little bits of a riff here. I'll let you listen to it by itself. Like, I just really liked that. I didn't want to retrack it, and all we have on here is just some EQ shaping. It's the same on both. Just a nice gentle roll off at 120, smooth dip at 400, and then we're just getting rid of a lot of the top end, like above, so what, 7K or so. We're just removing a lot of that. We'll listen to the before and after. Let's see here. Make sure they're both on. Okay. There's also some gain staging going on here, pulling things down about 2 dB. It's giving it a little bit of a radio effect and just getting rid of all that rumbly stuff, just like we did on the strumming guitars. But essentially I didn't want to recreate this from the demo. I thought it sounded really, really good on the original demo, and so I just copy pasted them over into the new session and then retracked all of the guitars. So that's why this is kind of on its own little group down here. It's also the only point in the song where there's technically 3 guitars playing, so I'll let you hear that. Cool. And then we have the all guitars bus. So all of the guitars here are being fed into this plugin chain. So nothing on the EQ, we're just boosting 1.5 dB. And then we have the Pultec MEQ5. I love the Pultecs on guitars. For whatever reason, the curves that are built into this EQ just work really well for like guitar distortion and stuff. So you can see here we've got 3 different knobs. We've got peaks that we can increase, and we have 1 dip where we can do a reduction. And I'm using all 3 of them. So we are boosting, and this isn't necessarily dB on these knobs. It's just kind of an arbitrary amount. But usually right around 3 to 3.5 dB on these knobs is where you start to notice a difference. So we are increasing around 500K just a little bit, and then we are doing a dip at 500 as well, and then we have a peak at around 3K. So let's listen to that. Let's go back to the chorus, I suppose. So let's listen to the guitars in isolation really quick. Not a whole lot of difference there. Let's listen to the guitars and the bass together. Not hearing a whole lot of difference there. It seems pretty subtle to me. I think these 2 moves are probably counteracting each other quite a bit. And it's really just increasing the top end. And again, this may have been something that I came back to and tweaked at various points throughout the mix. Maybe at some point I felt like I needed to bring back some of that 500 that had been removed earlier, and then I changed my mind and decided to cut it out, and maybe didn't realize that I had increased it with this peak knob. So that could just be me being a weirdo. We could probably turn off the Pultec and it wouldn't make much difference in the mix, to be completely honest. Next, we are going into the mix rack. We're getting a little bit of saturation out of this mix bus plugin, just like we did with drums. And then we've got some EQ and some gain staging going on. So let's take a listen to this. Let's go back to this breakdown here at the end of the song. Cool. Again, very, very subtle. I'm not even pushing it into the red. And then we have a little bit of a boost in the top end, about 2 dB at 7K, a little bit of a reduction on the super highs, and that is it. So very, very subtle. This was probably me towards the end of the mix, making small tweaks to the guitars as a whole, and bringing the guitars up just a little bit. So we'll take a listen to that. Yep, just making the guitars a little bit more present, getting a little bit more level out of them. And then here on all guitars, we've got a side-chained Soothe 2. So let's see what we got going on here. We are receiving the vocals. So the guitars are getting cut whenever the vocals play. Now I have the vocals muted right now, so you're not hearing them. But basically what we're doing is we're removing the resonant frequencies of the vocal from the guitars. And this is allowing us to make some room for the vocals in a dynamic way. Again, big fan of dynamic plugins. And as the frequencies of the vocal change and move throughout the song, it's going to remove those specific frequencies from the guitars. This is a lot better at making space for vocals than a static EQ cut wherever the vocals seem to be the strongest at. Now let's move up to the guitar solo. Not a whole lot going on here. We've got some panning coming in from the right side as the solo comes in, and then coming in from the left side as the second section of the solo plays. So let's listen to that really quick with no plugins. That was pretty quick. Cool. Let's see what we got going on. Take 2 just has a 16th note delay, and then take 1 just has some lustrous plates reverb going on. So we've got some reverb on the first part of the solo and some delay on the second part. Let's listen to that. Just adding a little bit of dimensionality to the solo. And let's take a listen to this second part. And I really like what it's doing there, where I'm kind of playing some lower notes on the solo. It's really cool how those lower sections kind of delay over the higher section, and it creates this little melody. Just a cool effect that I liked with the delay, so I kept it. And then on the guitar solo as a whole, carving a ton of low end out of the guitars, getting rid of some low mids, and then probably some harshness around 2K. Let's take a listen to that. Also boosting quite a bit, so there's a lot being added there. Let's listen to these changes without the boost. Definitely clearing things up quite a bit. Pretty basic stuff there. Removing some harshness with Soothe. especially because I'm tapping those notes there at the beginning, so there's a lot of resonance there. You're hearing a lot of harmonic content, and this is keeping all of those high, shrill frequencies in check so they don't pop out too much. And then on this final EQ, we've just got some dynamic cut going on here around 1K. Again, because we want the rhythm guitars to carry the mid-range as much as possible. And this is reacting to the mid-range of the lead and bringing it down so that even though the rhythms aren't the focus, you can still hear them pretty damn well. Instead of rolling a ton of top end off of the rhythm guitars to make room for a solo, I opt to do this instead, where we're just dynamically removing the important stuff so that the solo can shine. This just makes more sense to me because I don't want to lose the rhythm guitar entirely. Mainly because I think I'm a Meshuggah fan, and Meshuggah always saves the coolest riffs for when the guitar solo comes in, and I always want to be able to hear it. So that's probably me just channeling my inner Meshuggah fanboy there, trying to keep the rhythm guitars audible even when they're not the focus. Alright, so that is pretty much it for the guitars. There's a decent amount going on here with the vocals. Let's take a look at the main chain. So these 4 gray tracks here are the main vocals. Let's unmute. Everything else I have muted at the moment. I know I have some active plugins and stuff down here, but all you're going to hear here is the main vocals, the dubs, and the left and rights. And then all I have going on is gain reduction 2 and an EQ. The EQ is just removing some low end that I know I don't need in the vocal. And then we have gain reduction 2. And my settings here are all, I think, default. I don't think I messed with any of this stuff other than doing the shift double click on the input here to calibrate the incoming vocal level into the plugin. But aside from that, I think we're at default settings. So let's just listen to the beginning of this chorus really quick. I'm going to play the vocals in isolation with and without gain reduction. Let's listen to that main vocal.
I'll take it all!
Obviously we've got some work to do, right? The vocals are kind of murky sounding. There's a nice like gravelly kind of grit to his voice naturally. So we need to bring that out, make the vocals sound a lot more clear, especially compared to everything that we've done to the instruments.
I'll take it all!
And that's a great first step. I love gain reduction too because it solves so many problems so quickly, and we can move on to the more creative aspects of the vocal. So that's all I have going on each of these 4 vocals. So let's take a listen to the group by itself.
I'll take it all!
What a hell of a take there.
I'll take it all!
So obviously the vocal is going to need to come up, it's going to need to be brighter. So let's take a look at the vocal bus, or the vocal group here, this blue track. These 4 main tracks are being fed into, and this is what we have. First off, a de-esser, pretty straightforward stuff, nothing crazy. Not a lot of S's in that part. We've got a mix bus here for a little bit of saturation. And it's definitely in the red, but in the parts where there's like 3 tracks, like here at the beginning, we're pinning the vocal into saturation there. We're not quite hitting the red light, but it is definitely bringing the peaks of the vocal down and making them more pleasant. And then we've got 2 compressors. And again, we're using the mix knob here set to the perfect amount. Oh, this one's off. There we go. So we've got a fast 1176 setup, and then we've got a slower FG2A setup. This is a classic vocal chain that's been used for decades. No sense reinventing the wheel in this scenario. We just want to level out the vocals, and make things audible from start to finish. So let's listen to before and after in this section.
To the ends of the world, this is my right. I'll have what's mine. To the ends of the world, this is my right. I'll have what's mine. My crooked legs stand firm while the giant rocks of time.
And you can see the needles dancing in different parts, right? Like sometimes the 1176 is what's doing the most work, and sometimes it's the FG2A, and sometimes they're both working really hard, just depending on how fast the transients are and the delivery of the vocal. That's why it's important to stage your compression on vocals, really on any instrument, but vocals are really, really dynamic. There's a lot of moving frequencies that can affect the input of that compressor in different ways. So that is why, again, we're not throwing away all of the knowledge of decades of audio engineers. There's a reason why this combination of compression works on vocals. So I ran with it, and it worked really well in this context, and so I didn't feel the need to do anything crazy. So now I'm going to turn on these extra tracks down here before we dive into the sends up at the top. So these 5 tracks here, I used some kind of plugin, right? The group chant, I probably used some chorus, some delay. The lo-fi group has been lo-fied with an EQ. This has got some type of echo plugin. This has got delay. So these are all just different groups that I set up to get a specific effect out of the vocals, and then I printed it down and deleted that plugin chain. So I can't tell you exactly what I used, but I can let you listen to it in isolation. Let's go here.
Own it! It's in my own hands! It's in my own hands! It's in my own hands! It's in my own hands!
So it's kind of got a megaphone kind of effect. Not very gritty, but it's kind of got this distance to it, which is nice, and like this kind of slap back delay sound. We've got this spoken word part that Mike did that I kind of tried to make sound murky.
Written in stone, the same weight pressed onto my chest. I lay the very foundation that I will rise above.
Very impactful. You can hear the P's, the plosives of the vocal. Normally you would try to get rid of that stuff, but because it's the focus and there's a lot of stuff going on around the vocal, it just helps it pop.
Written in stone, the same weight pressed onto my chest. I lay the very foundation that I will rise above.
And we're gonna get the level of the vocal up, but at the end of a mix, what I end up doing is I turn down the vocal like 1 or 2 dB on the last plugin, and then I route around my mix bus and bring the volume back so that I have a version of the vocal that's not being affected by the mix bus processing, so that even if things get a little bit slammed in the busier or more energetic sections, the vocal will remain at a consistent level independent of what's going on with the instrumentation. So that's why you're hearing kind of you're hearing a vocal that's not as loud as it should be, and it's not as loud as it is in the final mix, because we haven't gotten to the mix bus processing stuff, and I have those tracks that are routed around the mix bus muted at the moment. It's all going to make sense. It's all going to come together as we move towards the end of this mix. So I have 3 sends set up here. First is a vocal smash, and I'll let you hear that in isolation.
I'll take it off!
Pretty straightforward stuff. We are first using a clipper and then going into a limiter with this coloration turned on. I'm just going to let you hear together.
I'll take it off!
I'm just routing this vocal group into the smash. So you're hearing exactly all of this processing that we've already discussed, and that's being fed into this clipper and this limiter.
I'll take it off! I'll take it off!
Just pinning the vocal, bringing out some of the distortion a little bit with the clipper.
I'll take it off!
3 dB of clipping on the vocal, that's pretty excessive in my opinion. So that's what we have for the vocal smash, and then that is just blended in. It's set at around -17, and again I probably had the vocal just under where I wanted it, and I got a little bit of extra excitement and volume out of the vocal with this smash track. Now we've got a room. This is kind of a short reverb room. I'm using Verb Suite Classics on the doubled vocal preset, and here's what that sounds like in isolation. instantly gone, right? We've just got 279 milliseconds, so it's a fifth of a second, essentially, a little more than a fifth of a second. So this is just adding a little bit of depth to the vocals so that it doesn't sound dry in comparison to the guitars and the drums. Let's take a listen to a different part. Let's go here.
Intrusive thoughts, impossible words. Intrusive thoughts, impossible words. Chip away.
Just kind of makes the vocals exist in a space a little bit better. And then we have this third track that I call vocal tail, because again we're using lustrous plates, which adds a really nice, elegant sounding tail. It's kind of similar to Valhalla if you have Valhalla, but it's just this overly exaggerated long tail reverb. It's nice for certain situations, and so you can see it's at minus infinity except for this one little section here. So let's take a listen to that. You can see the automation here. And you can hear that tail. Just have a nice little fade, little transition effect there. And then here on all vocals, we've got a little plug-in chain going. Now, I'm using Helix Native on the vocals because there were some specific effects that I really like in Helix Native. I kind of used this EQ, I cut some low end, I added a reel, like a tape kind of effect, a megaphone distortion, a hall reverb, and then some compression at the very end of the chain. And let's see where I have that turned on. So it's in this section we just listened to. Let me get rid of some other stuff here. Let's listen to it. Oh, I can't turn it off because of the automation. So let's pull this automation down really quick and take a listen.
Written in stone, the same way pressed onto my chest, I lay the very foundation that I will rise above. Hand over fist over mind over matter, I cloud.
I think that's a pretty sweet effect. Makes him sound like he's coming through a megaphone, but also in a cave. And I thought it sounded really sweet here. The mod, I'm just using a ton of wow to kind of make things sound fluttery. And then the distortion, the megaphone, is giving you that very classic megaphone effect. It's just scooping and just focusing in on the mid-range. And then we're using this dynamic hall to add a little bit of tail. And I think it's just got a really cool effect here.
Written in stone, the same way pressed onto my chest, I lay the very foundation that I will rise above.
I mean, it's night and day. It just makes this part sound awesome.
Written in stone, the same way pressed onto my chest, I lay the very foundation that I will rise above. Hand over fist over mind over matter, my cloud, the soil and into the skies, with all failures relegated to the grave. If giving my everything means losing myself along the way, then I'll give my word.
Cool, so we're just using the Helix in this one section. Other than that, it's bypassed. And then after that, this is being applied to all of the vocals, by the way, right? All vocals means all vocals, all the wet tracks, all the dry tracks. So on the EQ, we've got a nice gentle roll off at 100, just to make sure there's no useless rumbly stuff going on. And then again, multi-pass on vocals. I love using multi-band distortion as an EQ. And again, learned the trick from Buster. You could probably find the relevant video on YouTube if you type in Buster Oldholm Saturn trick. And here, instead of muting the high frequencies, I'm just muting everything under 100 hertz on the vocals, because for me it's useless. There aren't a lot of like tunnel, like low end, throaty screams in this. Like everything's mostly in the mid range with some high end stuff. So I just felt like it wasn't doing anything for the mix. I got rid of it. And then just like on the drums, I just push the drive up to the maximum setting and then roll it back slightly so you're not hearing any distortion artifacts. and I do that for each band independently, and then just gain stage each one with the gain knobs down here to get the overall EQ that I want. So here's without. And it's really cool because distorting things in this way, especially with a multi-band, just like with the drums, it has a way of pushing things back, but still keeping things audible. It sounds almost paradoxical, but anything that sounds pokey, you can push it back in the mix and keep it from like jabbing you in the ears. It doesn't feel like it's losing volume. It's kind of a trick on the ears that distortion is bringing out all of the harmonic content in each band, making everything more audible while making the peaks not as peaky, I guess. I wish there was a better way to explain that, but that's what it sounds like to my ears. So now we pretty much just have the extras, and then we have the mix bus, the outside tracks, and then the master. So on the extras, this is all of the MIDI that I programmed, other than I'm using Sub Destroyer for the bass drops. But for the risers, the pads, and the whoosh effects, I'm using Evolution Devastator. This is an awesome, really affordable plugin that just has thousands of sounds. I mean, there's so much stuff in here for post-production. Everything from bass drops, risers, impacts, pads, ambience, like cinematic movie trailer sounds. So you can do more than just make metal songs with this. And it's just incredibly versatile. And I didn't actually print anything out because I have a beastly computer for the first time in my life. So I just left the plugins active, and you have the printed out versions without the processing. So these tracks up here are just the MIDI, and then the actual audio is flowing through these bottom tracks. That's why they say prints. So I printed these out with these plugins turned off, and that's what you have in your session. So let's take a listen to some of these effects. At the beginning of the song, we've got this pad. Again, very subtle. I'm going to play from the beginning of the song. It doesn't sound subtle with the plugin turned off, right? We've got quite the EQ, or I'm sorry, quite the plugin chain going on here. So this is pad 1 at the beginning, so we want pad 1. Cutting a ton of low end, and that's what was really present. And then we're hitting a tape machine, and then we are doing a dip at 1.5K, probably just to make room for that intro guitar. So let's take a listen to that with the plugins on now. Then we have that little whoosh sound to help with the transition. Ultimately, at the beginning, I just wanted it to sound kind of breathy, just something to add a little bit of texture behind the guitars. And then we have this whoosh effect. That's what I've called it, whoosh 1. And that's just got some gain staging, just turning it down a bunch coming out of the plugin. So let's take a listen to that in isolation really quick. Awesome effect. And then I have whoosh 2, which again, just some gain staging. It's just a different duration. Oh, you're hearing something else there. Cool. So we've got these whoosh effects right here at a couple different parts in the song just to help push the transitions a little bit. In the choruses, I have riser 1, riser 2. So let's take a listen to that. You kind of heard it there for a second. Let's go solo. And all I did was I found the main note that's being played there on the guitar. that da 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 da, and I just kind of matched that with the riser. And then let's see what we have for plugins here. We have an EQ, which is just adding 1.5 dB. We've got a limiter, just limiting the crap out of the sound because we're using it very, very subtly. So we want it to be audible, but we don't care if it has dynamics. We want the instruments to have dynamics. That's what people are really listening to. This is just the cherry on top, right? We've got doubler 2 from Waves, just making it spread a little bit in the stereo image. Side widener, again, spreading it even further, but doing it in a way that's mono compatible. And then we have a final EQ, just reducing some of that really high top end so that it doesn't pop out of the mix too hard. So let's listen to that before and after really quick. Nothing crazy there, and you probably didn't even know it was there, to be honest. Let's listen to it full mix. Awesome, it's doing its job. It's just very subtly pushing the mix along in the chorus. And then we have pad 1 comes back from the intro, that kind of breathy sound. Again, not doing a whole lot. It's pretty subtle, but like in the car or in any place where there's like a lot of space for you to hear, it's kind of just filling in the gaps and just making things sound a little bit more ambient. And then at the very end of the song, we have one more pad, and this is just accentuating what's going on with the guitar solo. So I'm going to let you listen to that really quick. We just have this very narrow EQ, so we're just focusing in on 2K here. And let's take a listen to it on its own. Now let's listen to that in context. Again, just kind of similar to the intro, it's just kind of adding this breathy ambient effect behind the guitar solo, and it's kind of making the guitar solo sound like it has even more reverb. Just kind of a cool effect, added a little bit more ear candy to the solo that I liked. Going into the mix bus, I think we checked this earlier. It's a new day now compared to earlier in this video, so I may be going over this again, but all I've really done here is I've put a cut at 16 hertz. I don't know why I picked 16, but I really just wanted a low-end boost right around 20 hertz because the bass is tuned really, really low, and in those really low moments, I just wanted there to be a little bit of a boost to the fundamental. We are doing a dynamic reduction at around 500. Again, with everything playing together, even though we've already reduced a lot of 500, that's kind of a critical spot for muddiness. And so this is my way of dynamically just reining that in a little bit more. Max volume, again, this is a limiter, but I'm only using this low level threshold fader. And what this is doing is it's taking all of the low level information in the mix and bringing it up. So another way to think about this is the limiter is bringing down the ceiling of the mix, and then I'm gain staging and bringing everything up. So it's going back to that relativity that we were talking about earlier, where you can get two different effects depending on how you do it. If you remove a peak and then gain stage and bring that peak back up to where it was before, now you've just brought all of the low end information up by using a limiter. So that's what I'm doing here on the entire mix. Then we're clipping, we're just clipping up 2 dB. So I'm pushing the mix past 0 and clipping it off at 0. So we're just taking the top 2 dB off the mix, adding a little bit of top end. This was probably a last minute decision. because I've also reduced it. So I've kind of boosted a little bit in the mid-range and in the top end, and then gain stage back down. So technically this is adding low end. And then lastly, we have FGX2, probably my favorite limiter. I'm a big fan of FGX1, although it has its quirks. This was kind of the next iteration, and it does have some nice quality of life features. I have the compressor turned off. I'm just using it for true peak limiting. We're boosting some top end above 7K. We're boosting a little bit underneath 120. We're saturating the mix a little bit. We're prioritizing the low end with this balance knob, and we are smoothing some of the limiting artifacts. And we're just pushing the mix up to -1 with the limiter. So let's just take a listen to the chorus one more time without the mix bus. And that's really what I like to see. I don't really like to limit a mix more than maybe 2 or 3 dB at the most, because anything beyond that, you're gonna start to get some pumping, and I don't really want that out of this song. This is a tight progressive metal song, so I don't feel like it needs any pumping. Now we have 2 outside tracks, and this kick and bass, sometimes I will sidechain the kick to the bass. It's a pretty popular thing to do in like hip hop and rap, and also in metal because of double kick drums. They tend to pump mixes if they're being pushed through the mix bus too hard. But I really wanted the bass guitar to be the focus of this song. So what I've done is I've fed the kick and the bass from the all bass and from the kick group. So all of the processing that's on the kick and on the bass is being fed into this track that goes around the mix bus, and I'm using really fast attack, medium release, and I'm just basically smashing the kick and the bass together. So anytime the kick hits, it's going to overload this compressor, and it's going to bring the volume of the bass down. And I'll let you listen to that on its own. It's nice because every time the kick hits, the bass gets out of the way. And every time the bass is playing, it's being pushed up in the mix. And so you're basically getting rid of the attack on the bass, especially because the kick and the bass tend to hit at the same time, right? A lot of times the bass player is locked in with the kick drum, and that's how this song is in most of the sections. So when the kick hits, it's ducking the pick attack on the bass, and then it's making the bass pop up in between kick hits. Now what I usually do when I do this trick is I'll take my final mix and I'll go, okay, everything is at a good level, but I want to blend this track outside the mix bus without it ruining the balance that I already have. I'll go to the kick and I'll go to the bass and I'll turn it down like 1.5, 2 dB, and then I will blend this outside track into the mix until I get back up to the level that I was before. Now I just have a parallel version of that signal that's not being affected by the mix bus processing. So no matter what's going on in the song, the kick and the bass are going to be at a fairly consistent level. And then we have the same thing for the vocals. There's no plug-in here. This is just all vocals being sent to a track outside the mix bus and then blended in, and I'm turning the original vocal track down to make room for it. So now that we have these tracks turned up, the kick, the bass, and the vocals that were a little bit too quiet in the mix are now going to be at the optimum level. Cool. So the last thing here are some bass drops, and not all of them are bass drops actually. At the chorus, going into both choruses, we have a bass riser, I guess you would call it. Let's listen to that. Sounds kind of funny out of context, but it does add some energy going into the chorus. I think it sounds cool. The bass guitar is sliding up, I believe, from like the 12th fret up to 24, and it's kind of going woo. And so this is just adding a little bit more excitement to that section both times that it happens. So the opposite of a bass drop. Here we've got some fun bass drops in this transition. And this is just one bass drop that I printed out, copied and pasted, and then used a pitch plugin to change it to different values to match what's going on in the guitar riff. In the bass playthrough, I actually played these bass drops on the bass. And I did originally record it that way, but I just wanted it to be super clean in the final mix, so I cut these bass tracks out and replaced it with JST Sub Destroyer. And then at the very end of the song, going into the breakdown, we've got a really gnarly just to add a little bit more to the punch there. And then we just have a final limiter. And nothing crazy going on here. It's just set to true peak limiting. And I'm usually looking for around -7 to -10. -10 is a fairly quiet mix, and I think that's kind of where this is at, is around -10-ish. If this were like a deathcore song where it's just really chuggy and really, really to the point, like simpler, where the frequency range doesn't move so much, I would probably push this up to like -8, -7. But I tend to like mixes that aren't necessarily blown out. There's some really popular producers right now who are making really, really loud mixes, and I think it's to the detriment of the song, unless you're playing something like beat down hardcore where like the point is to just be violently heavy from start to finish. This song has its ebbs and flows, it has its contrast as the song plays, and so I want to keep that dynamic range available throughout the song. And that's why a lot of my compression moves are done in parallel, because I don't want to overdo it on compression, but I do like the character that compression adds. So this kind of gives me the best of both worlds and allows me to have a fairly balanced mix that's not overly hot, but also not the -14 quiet that Spotify supposedly wants. So that is pretty much the mix, guys. If you made it this far, thank you for sticking around and listening to me talk and ramble. Hopefully you learned something along the way. That's all I got for now, so I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I'll see you next time.